Welcome to Sparrow's Realm. Chapter 1. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I noticed was the canopy. Velvet, dark green, and heavy enough to make me wonder if someone had tried to trap me under it for dramatic effect. The air smelled like a library, and a florist had sneezed simultaneously. Old books and roses. Expensive roses. Very expensive. Which was weird, because last night, I had gone to bed in a one-room apartment that smelled like instant noodles and heartbreak. Not a single velvet thread in sight. I had no idea why my life had suddenly gone from sad freelancer with ramen-stained pajama pants to Duchess in distress with a silk nightgown. I blinked. Twice. Then glanced at the mirror across the bed. My reflection stared back at me. Pale, flawless skin. Loose curls the color of honey falling across my shoulders. And that silk nightgown. I swear I could see the price tag flashing. Buy me, and also sell a kidney. Oh no, I whispered. Not a dramatic oh no like in books. This was a full-body, existential, tear in the throat oh no. Because I knew that face. I had seen it before. On a book cover. On every tragic stepmother fan theory forum. On one of those novels where someone inevitably dies in chapter 28, probably surrounded by roses, gasping for breath while the villain monologues. I scrambled out of bed, tripped over something that looked suspiciously like my own foot, and landed face first on the plush carpet. Pain shot through my shoulder, but I was too busy panicking to notice. Lady Eira, are you hurt? The voice came from the doorway. A maid, small and prim, her hands fluttering in worry. Eira, I echoed, staring at her. She nodded politely. Her face was so composed, it was terrifying. Yes, I said, voice cracking. I am fine, really. Totally fine. Absolutely not dead yet. The maid's expression didn't change. She just raised an eyebrow, which somehow made me feel worse. Eira. My new name. The doomed Duchess who, according to my knowledge of the novel, was meant to die horribly at the hands of, well, someone unpleasant. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a tiny, sarcastic voice said, well, at least you're pretty before you die. I yanked the blankets over my head. Dramatically. If I could disappear under this green silk, maybe I could skip to a chapter where I didn't die. And then I made my first and most important vow. No dukes. No roses. No tragic plot lines. I'm going off script. I will live quietly, thank you very much. I will not be murdered. I will not faint into a bouquet of flowers. I will survive the story, even if it kills me. The universe, of course, had other plans. I got up, cautiously, and inspected the room. Antique furniture everywhere. A chandelier that could probably decapitate someone if it fell. Bookshelves stretching from floor to ceiling. A window that opened onto a balcony with sweeping views of a city that looked expensive. Way too expensive. I moved to it and peeked outside. Cobblestone streets glistened under morning sun. Carriages rolled by like something out of a movie. People in fine clothes bustled about. And then I saw it, the huge stone gate of a mansion across the street. Etched into the archway was a crest-a lion with a dagger. I shivered. I had read the book cover. That was exactly where I was supposed to be murdered. I spun around, imagining I could teleport back to my old apartment. My laptop. My ramen. My comfy, non-velvet life. But, alas, the rules of reality, or maybe bad storytelling, did not include teleportation. So I did the next best thing, checked for weapons. Spoiler, nothing useful. A feather duster, some candlesticks, and a strangely heavy book that I'm pretty sure was bound in human terrifying quality leather. I sank onto the edge of the bed, mentally drafting my survival plan. Step 1. Avoid the male lead. Specifically, the man who was supposed to kill me. Step 2. Avoid roses. Apparently, they were not just plants in this story. Step 3. Do not faint or swoon. Do not cry dramatically in public. Do not trust anyone who smiles too much. I was taking notes in my head when the door opened again. This time, it wasn't a maid. A man entered the room, and I nearly screamed. Tall. Broad shoulders. Hair black as midnight. Eyes like a stormy lake. Calm, piercing, and apparently immune to my panic-induced hyperventilation. He glanced at me, and the universe hit me with a memory flash so sharp I almost dropped my notebook. That was him. My future murderer. My romantic nightmare. My marry and then horribly die scenario. I tried to think of something clever to say. Something brave. Something that would not end with me dead on page 28. All I could manage was, hello. He inclined his head slightly. Good morning, Lady Eira. The polite tone, combined with his terrifyingly composed expression, made my knees weak. I had to sit down. The velvet bed seemed safer than standing. I'm fine, I stammered. Completely fine. Totally okay. Not panicking at all. Definitely not imagining how this story is going to end. He smiled faintly. Not a cruel smile. Not a menacing smile. Just unsettlingly pleasant. I flopped back onto the bed, covered my face with a pillow, and muttered, maybe I should start learning to fly. Or at least how to hide in plain sight. And somewhere deep in the mansion, I heard the faint rustle of curtains and footsteps. My new life, apparently, had already begun. The chapter ended in my mind with a sigh. Step 1 of survival, don't die. Step 2, figure out who the hell this man is before he decides I'm disposable. Step 3, buy a lot of running shoes. Because this story wasn't just bad, it was about to get worse. Chapter 2. By the time evening rolled around, I had convinced myself of a few comforting lies. Lie 1. Maybe it wasn't the novel. That was plausible. Lie 2. Maybe the butler's name, Ramil, was just an odd coincidence. Lie 3. Maybe the brooding duke in the giant gilded portrait wasn't a prelude to my inevitable demise, maybe he was just a very moody decorator's choice. I clung to those lies like a life raft. Then came the royal banquet. I had 10 minutes before disaster struck. 10 blissful, delusional minutes where I convinced myself I could blend in among the glittering nobles, sip wine delicately, and perhaps practice small talk without hyperventilating. And then he entered. Tall, broad-shouldered, hair black and shiny enough to reflect chandeliers. Eyes stormy, dangerous, and somehow piercing directly into my soul. Duke Lucen Eira 3 He didn't walk in. He descended, like gravity itself respected him. The entire hall went quiet. Conversations cut mid-sentence. Musicians forgot to play. Even the dessert cart paused in mid-roll. I blinked. He was real. My nightmare wasn't fictional. And somehow, he managed to look calm while the universe collectively held its breath. I panicked. Naturally, my first instinct was to hide behind the nearest object. A dessert tower seemed perfect, tall, sugar-coated, and completely useless as protection against a Duke of Doom. I ducked behind it, trembling, when a passing noble jostled me. The champagne glass in my hand tipped over, sending a stream of bubbly liquid right down his chest. Time slowed. Everyone gasped. Candles flickered. I was sure I'd seen my life flashing before me. He looked down at the wet stain. Not angry. Not startled. Calm. Too calm. Menacingly calm. Lady Eira Valen, he said. The deep, rich baritone hit me like a brick of pure panic. We meet at last. I stammered something incoherent. I'm allergic to social events. He raised an eyebrow. One eyebrow. Like a judge examining a particularly irritating criminal. Or, in my case, a doomed duchess. I see, he said, tilting his head. And yet here you are. I wanted to run. Preferably diagonally, preferably through a window. I scanned the hall for exits. Too many chandeliers. Too many dignitaries. Too many swords. I considered faking a faint. Perhaps collapsing elegantly into a nearby chair, with a well-timed gasp. But then he'd have to help me up, and let's be honest, that sounded even worse. Instead, I attempted to back away, muttering a string of apologies and incoherent nonsense about how clumsy I was. He followed. Calmly. Step by step. The horror. After a torturous eternity of dodging polite introductions and elaborate food platters, I finally ended up outside in the cool night air. The city glowed below me, the cobblestone streets stretching endlessly. My chest heaved. My brain raced. And then the thought hit me, maybe I could leave. Just leave. Disappear into the night. Take a carriage to a distant village, fake my own death, buy a small farm, become a beekeeper. Hell, I could even name the bees and live in blissful anonymity. Except there was one tiny problem. The universe had other plans. I turned to check the entrance, and there he was. Leaning casually against a column, looking impossibly composed despite his wet jacket. What from what, I wasn't sure. Perhaps divine interference. Perhaps pure theatrical timing. You look unwell, he said softly, which somehow made my knees shake even more. Yes. I was hot and faintly traumatized, I stammered. My logic was impeccable. Completely normal. He took a step closer. I took 2 steps back. Then a balcony railing, then a fountain. I realized too late that I was backing myself into a corner. Do you often panic at banquets? He asked, eyebrow raised, tone calm enough to kill. No. I mean, sometimes. Rarely. Not at all. I gestured vaguely at the glittering crowd inside. Social situations are hazardous to my health. He didn't laugh. That was the problem. Instead, he tilted his head again, studying me. Like I was a puzzle. A very confusing, slightly alarming puzzle. Interesting, he said, and for some reason, my brain interpreted that as both a threat and a compliment. I swallowed, thinking desperately. Maybe if I ignored him, he'd vanish. Maybe if I acted small and quiet, I could escape unnoticed. Maybe just maybe I could become a shadow, a whisper, a ghost in my own life. I peeked through my fingers. He hadn't moved. He was still looking at me, calm, composed, terrifying. And then, he smiled. Just a little. Not cruel, not menacing. Slight. Too subtle to trust. My thoughts collapsed. I am doomed. I decided, with all the sense of someone teetering on a cliff, that it was time for a new plan. A bold plan. A run away from the city and grow my own vegetables while pretending to be someone else's plan. And somewhere in the shadows of the palace gardens, I swear I heard the universe laughing. Quiet, patient, and utterly delighted in my panic. I sighed. My future as a duchess and probable murder victim was about to get very interesting. Chapter 3. I was cornered. Literally. Not figuratively. Not in the I feel trapped by social expectations sense. I was pressed against a cold marble column a little too close to the giant fountain that occasionally sneezed water onto unsuspecting nobles, with Duke Lucen looming in front of me like a storm that had taken human form. His dark eyes were fixed on me, calm, calculating, terrifying. He had that way of looking at you like he already knew every embarrassing secret you'd ever committed and was mentally cataloging them in a notebook somewhere. My knees were weak, my heart was thumping like a drum solo, and my brain had officially declared a vacation. Your family's circumstances, he began, his voice rich and deep, the kind of voice that could make someone forget to breathe, must be difficult. I can offer stability. Protection. Protection? I thought frantically. Protection from what himself? Or the way my life clearly screamed tragedy waiting to happen, before I could formulate a coherent plan because forming coherent plans under extreme threat was clearly not my strong suit. He dropped the sentence that would seal my fate. Would you consider becoming my wife? I choked on air. My brain froze. Time slowed. A candle guttered. Somewhere, a harpist's hand twitched mid-pluck. My internal monologue yelled, "This is bad. Very bad. Do not answer. Pretend you're invisible. Maybe climb the chandeliers and escape." And then my mouth betrayed me. Sure. Yes. Sure. Like it was a casual lunch invitation, not the official declaration of my doomed Duchess future. The world went silent. Someone behind me gasped audibly, and I could swear the orchestra stopped playing mid-note just to honor my catastrophic blunder. I froze completely. My thought process repeated like a broken record. No. 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 I was supposed to say, "I'm sure you're joking." I meant to say, "I'm sure you're joking." I definitely meant to. Why did I say the last word instead? Lucen's lips curved faintly. A smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, calm as ever, terrifying as ever. Very well. And, just like that, my life had officially gone off script. I wanted to scream, faint, run, or all three simultaneously, but the polite gasps of nobles around me froze my limbs. I tried to recover. Wait. But Lucen didn't give me the chance. He turned slightly, eyes scanning the room as if nothing had happened, leaving me standing against a column with my mouth still hanging open and my dignity in shreds. I spent the rest of the evening in a haze. Every time I tried to speak to him, my words tangled into a jumble of nonsense. I tried to summon my inner sarcasm warrior, but it collapsed under the weight of panic. After the banquet, I decided I needed an emergency plan. Step 1. Find Lucen and clarify the catastrophic misunderstanding. Step 2. Maybe invent a sudden illness. Step 3. Fake my death if all else failed. I asked the butler where I could find him. The man raised a brow and, in that calm, unflappable way only seasoned butlers possess, said, "His Grace has already sent a marriage contract to your family, Lady Eira." I think I blacked out for a second. I came to, gripping the marble column as though it could anchor me back to sanity. "So let me get this straight," I whispered. I am engaged. To him. To the Duke of Rion. The man I've been planning to avoid at all costs. The man I am fairly certain is plotting to kill me according to the novel. Engaged. Legally. Formally. No takebacks. Not even a whoops, I misspoke. Yes. That was the reality. Panic set in again. I went through possible escape scenarios. None worked. Perhaps I could feign illness again. No, he'd see through it. Perhaps I could bribe someone to forge a counter-contract. Too many witnesses. Perhaps I could sprout wings and fly, don't even joke about it. By the time I reached my room, I was pacing like a caged animal. I muttered to myself, Step 1, survive. Step 2, survive. Step 3, survive. I flopped onto the velvet chaise and stared at the ceiling. The chandelier above me glinted ominously. Its crystals caught the candlelight like tiny daggers. I imagined one falling and taking me out early. Perhaps it was the universe's subtle hint that I had failed at step 1. The door opened quietly and Ramil, the unflappable butler, peeked in. "Shall I prepare your evening tea, Lady Eira?" "Yes," I said, trying to sound normal. "And, can you prepare me a manual on how not to die in the next chapter?" He raised one perfectly sculpted eyebrow and said nothing, which I took as a negative. I lay back, staring at the ceiling, imagining all the ways this could go wrong. I could accidentally insult him at dinner. I could trip over my gown at the ceremony. I could faint in the middle of a toast. And that was just the first week of engagement. By midnight, I had a new plan. Not a good plan. Not a safe plan. But a plan nonetheless. If I was going to be trapped in this ridiculous story, I would need to survive every single absurdity it threw at me. Including the man who now casually lounged somewhere in the castle, probably imagining I had gracefully accepted my fate rather than panicking like a complete fool. I sighed and muttered to the ceiling, note to self: never, ever speak when panicking. Especially when your life might literally depend on it. The only problem? I had no idea how to stop panicking. And somewhere in the dark corridors of the mansion, I swear the universe chuckled. Loudly. Mockingly. Chapter 4. A week later, I found myself standing at the altar, staring at an intricately carved golden frame that served as the backdrop to my doom. My hands were shaking inside gloves that felt like they were made to strangle me. My silk gown weighed a ton, which was probably the first clue that the universe had decided weddings were not for comfort. Lucen stood across from me, statuesque as ever, expression perfectly neutral. No nerves. No joy. No trace of the panic that had completely consumed me at the banquet. Just cold, calm, terrifying composure. And then there was me. My emotions ricocheted like a rogue ball in a pinball machine. Horror, awe, disbelief, panic, awe again, terror, faint optimism, repeat. I was a human kaleidoscope of catastrophe. The priest droned through the ceremony in perfect monotone, as though he, too, had given up on the idea of a happy ending. "Do you, Lady Eira Valen, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" I tried to whisper, "Please let this be a dream," but only the word dream made it past my lips. Lucen's eyes met mine for the briefest moment, and I swear I saw patience or amusement. Hard to tell through centuries of practiced control. The ceremony continued. Vows were exchanged. Rings slipped onto fingers. And when the priest finally said, "You may kiss the bride," he didn't. Lucen didn't. He simply inclined his head and said, "Welcome home. Welcome home." Home. The word felt like a trap. And it was. The mansion, my new home, was everything you'd expect from a Gothic novel. Sprawling, shadowy, full of mirrors that reflected me in ways I wasn't ready to analyze. Velvet curtains, chandeliers that could decapitate, hallways long enough to lose oneself in existential despair. And the maids, oh, the maids. Each one whispered as I passed, "The last Duchess died young." Not helpful, I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. Then the housekeeper presented me with my new daily schedule: tea parties, charity events, hosting luncheons, attending military parades, and dutiful appearances beside the Duke. I stared at it as though it were a spell of doom. In sharp, red ink, I crossed every single item out and wrote one new directive in bold: stay alive. After surviving my first evening promenade, which consisted of bowing to 36 aristocrats who seemed determined to measure my worth by my waistline, I collapsed in my chambers. The room was enormous, decorated in a way that screamed Gothic horror chic, with high ceilings, velvet drapes, and a bed so massive I could lose a small village under the covers. The first night was uneventful, except for the occasional sound of someone knocking over a silver tray somewhere in the mansion. I flopped onto the bed and imagined myself back in my one-room apartment. Ramen. Pajamas. Instant noodles. Bliss. And then came the knock at the door. "Lady Eira?" Lucen's voice, calm, polite, and horrifyingly commanding. "I need a time machine," I muttered, burying my face in a pillow. "I'll see what I can do," he said, almost smiling. Not quite. Almost. Terrifyingly subtle. I peeked at him through one eye. He was standing there, coat perfectly straight, eyes unflinching, posture immaculate. I wanted to run, but running in a silk gown through a Gothic mansion seemed like a bad idea. So instead, I just sighed and sat up. You could at least have pretended to faint during the ceremony, I muttered. I calculated the risk, he replied. Fainting would have caused chaos and potentially broken a chandelier. I blinked. Oh, right. Safety first. Of course. He left after giving me a small bow. I wasn't sure if he expected me to thank him, beg for mercy, or just die quietly in the corner. I did none of the above, mostly because I wasn't sure if breathing was allowed yet. The next morning, I explored the mansion in a carefully curated panic. I discovered at least 3 secret passageways, 2 hidden libraries, and a portrait gallery that made me question whether the universe was really obsessed with tragic women named Eira. Do I have to live here? I whispered to myself while ducking behind a suit of armor. The armor didn't answer. Probably because it was a suit of metal. But I was sure I heard it creak judgmentally. Breakfast was another adventure. The dining hall was vast, with the ceiling painted to look like the sky at dusk. I accidentally poured orange juice on Lucen's napkin while trying to arrange my place setting without looking too nervous. He didn't react, except to fold the napkin with surgical precision and continue eating. My heart thumped like a war drum, and I decided right then that I was hopelessly outmatched. Over the next few days, the maids tried to teach me etiquette, proper walking in formal gowns, and how to sip tea without looking like a frightened raccoon. I mostly failed at all of them, but they tried so hard to hide their amusement that it was infuriating. By the end of the week, I realized 2 things. 1, the mansion was a death trap for someone unprepared, or someone with poor spatial awareness, aka me. 2, my Duke was unnervingly calm about all of it. Calm to the point where I suspected he might be secretly enjoying watching me flail. By the following evening, after another round of polite bows and welcome home, Lady Eira, I decided that survival meant being proactive. So I drafted a new set of rules. Rule 1, keep breathing. Rule 2, avoid chandeliers. Rule 3, avoid Lucen's intense gaze at all costs, but not too obviously, because that could also be dangerous. Rule 4, do not attempt to speak unless absolutely necessary. Rule 5, never ever admit panic. I wasn't sure how well I would follow them, but at least I had a plan. And in this mansion, full of dark corners, hidden staircases, and whispers of past tragedies, any plan was better than none. That night, as I lay in my enormous bed, Lucen knocked again. If you need anything, send for me, he said. I need a time machine, I muttered into the pillows, and somehow, that almost sounded like a complaint, or maybe a request. He lingered for a moment. I'll see what I can do. I didn't know whether to be terrified, relieved, or faint entirely. The universe had made one thing perfectly clear: my life as Duchess Eira Velen had officially begun. And it was going to be interesting. Chapter 5. I had spent the past week preparing for every possible disaster I could imagine as Duchess Eira Velen, fainting elegantly during formal dinners, being decapitated by a chandelier, tripping over my own gown while escaping a sword-wielding noble. But there was one scenario I hadn't rehearsed: meeting my new stepson. The novel made it very clear he would be terrifying. Twisted. Dark. Probably plotting to avenge some imaginary slight against his father. A little sociopath in breeches, lurking in the shadows with a sharpened gaze and the ability to ruin my life before breakfast. So I braced myself. Instead, I found a small boy with messy brown hair, slightly too big shoes, and eyes that could probably cut through steel. He didn't smile. He didn't fawn. He didn't even tilt his head in polite curiosity. He just looked at me. Judged. Silently. Menacingly, almost. You're the new one, he said finally, voice casual but sharp enough to make me reconsider my entire life. You smell like panic. I blinked. Blinked again. And then, with the kind of honesty only someone in total terror can muster, I said, because I am panic. He didn't laugh. He didn't flinch. He just gave me a sideways glance that suggested he had already decided my fate. Which, if my survival instincts were correct, was grim. This is Noen, the housekeeper said behind me. He's your stepson. Stepson. Adopted, like me. I swallowed, realizing that at least I shared one small thing in common with him. That and the potential to inherit a Gothic mansion full of ghosts, both literal and figurative. Noen, unsurprisingly, did not offer a handshake. Instead, he crossed his arms and tilted his chin up, as if to say, impress me, new Duchess. Nice to meet you, I said. My knees threatened rebellion. I brought sweets. He looked at the plate like it was radioactive. Sugar is for babies. Then, in a move that ruined my fragile ego, he grabbed half of the macarons and wolfed them down anyway. I frowned. That's hypocrisy. He shrugged. You can't survive in this mansion without knowing hypocrisy, he said sagely. Then he ran off, apparently satisfied with my performance. Over the next few days, I tried cautiously to bond with him. Tried reading to him. Tried helping with his studies. Tried engaging in small talk. All of which he responded to with one of three things. 1. Rolling his eyes. 2. Giving a pointed sigh of utter disappointment. 3. Eating whatever snack I offered and pretending he didn't like it. I started to notice patterns. He liked order. He disliked unnecessary fuss. He had a fondness for hiding in corners when he wanted to be alone. He had a deep respect for sarcasm, provided it didn't make him look weak. And he was lonely. I figured that out the night I accidentally walked in on him in the library. He had a book perched in his lap, small hands gripping it so tightly I thought the pages might tear, and his face set in the kind of concentration that screamed protective wall. You okay? I asked softly, because he looked like he might dissolve into tears at any second. He didn't answer. He just flicked a glance at me over the top of the book. I'm fine, he said. And I could tell immediately, he wasn't. Do you want to talk? I ventured. No, he said. I don't talk to strangers. I blinked. Then I leaned against the bookshelf, deliberately casual. You're not a stranger. I'm your stepmom. He coughed, probably at the word stepmom. I was told stepmoms are unreliable. I laughed. A short, sharp laugh. Well, maybe that's why I'm planning to be the best unreliable stepmom in history. You get sweets, safety, and sarcasm. That's my policy. He blinked. I swear I saw the tiniest twitch of a smile. Victory. That night, I watched him sleep by the firelight in his room. The flickering flames painted shadows across his face, and I realized that despite his sharp eyes and occasional surliness, he was just a small, lonely boy who had been handed a complicated life. I sat in the chair near the fireplace, silently making a promise. No, Enrion, I whispered, you are not going to grow up into the monster this story wants you to be. Not on my watch. I thought about the novel. The fate it had written for him. The darkness. The vengeance. The tragedy. I shivered. Somewhere in the mansion, I heard Lucen's quiet footsteps echo down the corridor. My pulse quickened. Had he overheard? Would he think I was being forward? Sentimental? Threatening? I decided not to look. Didn't move a muscle. Pretended I was merely an inanimate object, a chair, maybe a large decorative pillow. When the footsteps faded, I exhaled slowly. Survival, I reminded myself, came in small victories, getting through dinner without spilling wine, walking down the hall without tripping, and, apparently, promising to protect a small boy who looked like he could chew through steel if provoked. Over the next week, no one tested me constantly. He hid books I needed. He stole my pens. He claimed my desserts. He invented elaborate challenges designed to see if I would crack under pressure. I did not. Well, not entirely. But I laughed, I teased, I adapted. Slowly, I realized something important. We were a team, whether he knew it or not. And I was determined to be the kind of stepmother he could trust even if the story insisted otherwise. Because I refused to let a novel dictate his future. Or mine. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the quiet of the mansion. The wind rattled the windows, and the candlelight flickered like distant stars. Somewhere, Lucen moved through the halls silently, ever watchful, ever calculating. But for once, I didn't feel alone. No one was here. Messy hair, sharp eyes, and all. And somehow, maybe, that made surviving the story feel slightly more possible. Chapter 6. If good intentions earn medals, I'd have a wall full of them. Instead, I had smoke, chaos, and a very distinct smell of burnt butter that lingered in my hair like a personal badge of failure. My grand idea, which seemed brilliant at the time, was to cook breakfast for Noen. Just a small gesture to show him I wasn't some untouchable porcelain duchess imported for the sake of decorum, but a stepmother he could respect or at least tolerate. A warm pancake, a little syrup, maybe a smile. How complicated could it be? Apparently extremely. The kitchen was a grand affair. Gleaming marble counters, magical stoves that heated themselves, and more copper pots than I'd ever seen in my life. It looked intimidating, which I chalked up to dramatic effect until I lit the first burner and realized I had no idea which way to turn the knobs. Noen stood on a stool beside me, hands clasped as though performing some ritual. Sugar, he intoned solemnly, sprinkling it over the batter like he was conducting a funeral rite. I tried to focus, stirring my eggs, when the butter leaped from the pan as if it had its own ambitions. Then the pancake batter, sweet, innocent pancake batter, decided it wanted to become airborne. It splattered across the counters, dripped from the ceiling, and somehow landed in Lucen's favorite mug. I panicked. Desperately. My pan caught fire. Bright orange flames licked the edges, and I flailed like a drowning fish. And that's when he arrived. Lucen. Duke Lucen d'Eira, in his full glory. Calm, dark-haired, and terrifyingly composed, as though he had been expecting this exact scenario all along. He didn't shout. He didn't scold. He just muttered, "Stay back," and waved a hand, sending a cooling charm through the kitchen. In one sweep, the fire hissed and became steam, settling over the room like a magical fog of mild humiliation. Then he untied my apron. Slowly. Deliberately. My face flamed hotter than the pan had. "Let's hire help before you commit arson again," he said, voice calm enough to make my panic seem excessive. No one, watching with wide eyes and an almost gleeful grin, whispered, "We almost died." That was awesome. I glared at him. Awesome? You were 10 seconds away from being cooked alive, sugar priest. Worth it, he said, munching on a slightly charred croissant. You make a great explosion. I sighed. Kitchen disaster aside, it occurred to me that maybe domesticity was not my forte. I was a duchess who could survive murderous plots, navigate court intrigue, and face the supernatural with sarcasm as my only weapon, but apparently, scrambling eggs was beyond me. Later that day, I found myself sulking in the garden, attempting to salvage some dignity among the roses. The sun filtered softly through the trees, but my pride lay crushed under the remnants of burnt butter and pancake carnage. "You were trying to impress him," came a familiar, impossibly calm voice. I snapped around. Lucen was standing at the edge of the garden, hands behind his back, as unflappable as ever. His expression didn't betray annoyance, only observation. And maybe a hint of amusement. "I was trying to mother him," I said sharply, arms crossed. "Those overlap more than you think," he said, voice low and measured, but with an undercurrent that made me wish I had a helmet. I pretended not to hear the fondness. Instead, I flopped dramatically onto the bench. I set the kitchen on fire. He laughed. "I failed as a human." "You didn't fail," he said. "You tried. That counts for something." I groaned. "Something small, like the size of a teaspoon." "Better than doing nothing," he replied. His eyes softened for a fraction of a second, enough for me to suspect that somewhere deep in that icy facade was someone human. Before I could recover from that terrifying insight, no one appeared, still smudged with flour from our earlier war. "You need to practice again," he announced, brandishing a wooden spoon like a sword. "I'm your sensei now. You will not burn the kitchen again. At least, not completely." I groaned. "Sensei? You are practicing pancake combat." "Discipline is key," he said sternly. Then he tossed a sprinkle of sugar in my direction. I ducked, missed, and ended up covered in powdered sugar. Perfect. Lucen's eyes followed the exchange, his lips twitching. I swear I saw him stifle a smile. "See?" no one said. "This is what I mean about overlapping impressions. Cooking plus mothering equals chaos, but chaos is bonding." I blinked at him. "So you're saying my catastrophic failure is actually good?" "Yes," Lucen said suddenly, stepping forward. "It's memorable. And he will remember you fondly for it. Perhaps even respect you." I froze. Respect? Fondly? For a burnt mess who nearly set the kitchen on fire, the rest of the afternoon devolved into a series of increasingly ridiculous attempts at bonding exercises. No one insisted I sweep the floors with him while narrating an epic tale of a warrior fighting a pancake monster. I insisted he taste test all of my creations, even the slightly charred ones, to ensure they were edible. By evening, both of us were covered in flour, sugar, and an unidentified sticky substance that might have been jam. I sat on the steps, utterly exhausted. Lucen appeared again, this time leaning casually against the railing above me. "You're improving," he said, and I almost gagged. Not on the words, on the terrifying possibility that he was right. "No, I'm not," I muttered. "I'm still the Duchess of Disaster. And somehow, I think no one loves me for it." "Careful," he warned, voice low. "You may be setting dangerous precedents. Next thing you know, he'll expect you to survive court intrigue with the same panache." I groaned. I barely survived breakfast. He tilted his head, regarding me thoughtfully. "Perhaps, then, you're exactly the stepmother he needs." I blinked at him. Did I just hear fondness wrapped in a threat? Probably. Too terrifying to confirm. That night, as I lay in bed, exhausted and sticky with remnants of sugar and jam, I realized something. Surviving as Duchess Eira wouldn't be easy. But maybe bonding with Noen, despite the chaos, was worth every disaster. And maybe, just maybe, Lucen's quiet observation and subtle fondness weren't as terrifying as I'd imagined. Or maybe they were. Either way, I decided to sleep on it and hope the mansion didn't collapse on top of me in the night. Chapter 7. After the kitchen fiasco, I realized something important. Survival as Duchess Eira required rules. Not polite suggestions. Not gentle guidance. Not the kind of advice you scribble in a diary. I needed a plan that was airtight, simple, logical, and most importantly, emotion-proof. That meant one thing: a marriage contract. I spent the afternoon at the massive mahogany desk in the library, dipping a quill into ink and attempting to make something solemn and binding, all while my cat, yes, somehow the mansion had a cat, dark as midnight and twice as judgmental, stalked over the parchment like I owed it my soul. Rule 1. I'll raise Noen as a mother. Rule 2. You, the excessively handsome Duke, will stay emotionally uninvolved. I paused. That was probably unfair. Lucen wasn't completely emotionally uninvolved. He clearly had a habit of watching me like I was a fascinating experiment, but a girl had to be honest about her limitations. I added a third line for good measure. Rule 3. Surviving kitchen experiments is mandatory for both parties. I leaned back in the chair and admired my work. The ink had blotted in a few places. Some letters were jagged. And yes, excessively handsome was underlined twice. But this contract, this magical parchment, was going to keep me alive. I felt it. The next morning, I presented it to Lucen. He was in the library, reading one of the more intimidatingly thick legal tomes the mansion possessed. I placed the contract on the table with a flourish, trying not to tremble. I have drafted our rules, I said, trying to sound commanding, dignified, and not slightly terrified. He looked up at me, eyes narrowing in something suspiciously like amusement. Rules. Yes, rules. I pointed at the first line. I will raise Noen as a mother. You will. He lifted a hand, cutting me off. You mean guide him with care and wisdom? No. You will stay emotionally uninvolved. That's rule 2, I insisted, trying not to flare in panic. It's important for legal clarity. He tilted his head, lips curving slightly. That smile, or whatever tiny fraction of it existed, was like a trapdoor. I had to keep going. And rule 3. Both parties must survive kitchen disasters. Including, but not limited to, fire, exploding butter, or rogue pancake attacks. He didn't laugh. Not even a chuckle. Which was almost worse. Because it meant he was taking me seriously. I swallowed and pushed the contract toward him. Please sign. For survival purposes. And emotional security. And general sanity. He picked up the quill and, in one fluid motion, signed. His handwriting was perfect. Impossibly perfect. Gothic flourishes, straight lines, not a blot in sight. Then he added something I hadn't anticipated. A husband's duty includes keeping his wife safe even from herself. I stared at it. Blinked. Blinked again. Blinked a third time. That's not legal, I whispered, the words catching somewhere between disbelief and mortification. Then it's a personal vow, he said, that subtle, calm tone that always implied danger or affection or maybe both. I wasn't sure which, and my heart refused to choose. I snatched the contract back like it contained plutonium and stormed out of the room. My stomach was doing gymnastics, my hands were trembling, and somewhere deep inside, my brain was screaming, did he just care? Later that night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The moonlight slanted through the curtains in a way that made the mansion feel impossibly vast, impossibly quiet, and impossibly serious. Then, from somewhere down the hall, I heard it, a soft, almost private chuckle. Listen. I froze. Heart galloping. Was it amusement? Was it admiration? Was it mockery disguised as calm? I had no way of knowing, but my mind immediately decided it was probably dangerous either way. I muttered to the darkness, it's because my handwriting is terrible. Absolutely, entirely because my handwriting is terrible. Nothing else. Nothing romantic. Nothing threatening. Somehow, telling myself that didn't make me feel any safer. The next morning, I tried to pretend the previous day hadn't happened. Breakfast with Noen. A minor avalanche of powdered sugar. A charred croissant incident. Lucen silently observing in the background, cool and impossibly calm. I decided this needed to end, or at least be managed with strict, logical rules. So, I scheduled a rules meeting. with no one present, because if we were going to survive as a dysfunctional family, everyone needed to know the terms. I began, dramatically, like a general addressing troops. Listen carefully. Step 1. I am in charge of your daily nutrition and general well-being. Step 2. Your father, your husband, no one corrected immediately, with the precision of a tiny, authoritarian editor. Fine. Your husband, I continued, will act only within the parameters of this contract. I waved the parchment for emphasis. Contractually binding. Signed, witnessed, magical, and always possible. Lucen raised an eyebrow from across the table, and I swear it was simultaneously approving and terrifying. Noan frowned, tilted his head, and said, "Does this mean he'll stop glaring at you all the time?" "I'll take that as a positive sign," I muttered. The day continued with minor disasters. Spilled tea. A teetering tower of toast. Lucen observing silently, occasionally making small comments about proper posture or handling a teacup without breaking it. By the evening, I realized two things. One, the contract, while binding on paper, had absolutely no mechanism for controlling feelings. Especially feelings that might involve subtle fondness, amusement, or dangerous smiles. 2. I was increasingly aware of Lucen's presence. Always calm. Always observing. Always somehow charming even when he was terrifyingly silent. I decided to focus on survival. Rules. Structure. Practicality. And, perhaps, just a tiny bit of ignoring the fact that my heart was doing reckless gymnastics whenever he was near. Because that was for later. Right now, all that mattered was staying alive, keeping Noan intact, and navigating the treacherous waters of being a duchess with a husband who seemed far too perfect and far too calm for comfort. And maybe, just maybe, surviving this one personal vow that Lucen had so casually added to my contract. Chapter 8. My next self-improvement plan was both simple and terrifying. Confront my fear of roses. The universe had, after all, decided I would probably die among thorny stalks, bleeding in a greenhouse that smelled faintly of perfume and tragedy. If that was my fate, I reasoned, I might as well learn to befriend the enemy. So there I was, kneeling in the soil of the Rion family garden, which was vast enough to host small armies, and just about twice as intimidating. Dirt coated my knees, my gloves had been abandoned somewhere in my panic, and the smell of earth, mixed with roses, stung my senses in a way I couldn't quite place. I jabbed my spade into the dirt with more vigor than skill and muttered at the thorny stalks. "Try killing me now, you overdramatic weeds. I dare you." That's when a shadow fell over me. "Are you threatening the flora?" Lucen's voice, calm as midnight, sliced through my tirade. I looked up, squinting against the sunlight. He was there, standing perfectly still, hands behind his back, framed by light in a way that made him look like some sort of divine punishment or possibly a very judgmental angel. "Therapy," I said defensively, waving my spade like a wand. "Don't interrupt." He crouched beside me without ceremony, moving with a fluid grace that made me suspicious. Then, with maddening gentleness, he brushed dirt off my cheek. Just a faint touch, and my pulse immediately betrayed me, thumping like a drum in a war tent. "You're getting braver," he said, voice low, almost conspiratorial. I opened my mouth to retort, to insist that dirt and thorns were not bravery but pure survival instinct, but I froze. His laugh, warm, rare, genuine, broke the tension like a spell. And I, of course, did the most embarrassing thing possible. I blinked at him as though he had spontaneously grown wings and decided to judge me personally. I need water for the roses," I muttered, standing and trying to appear dignified while my knees protested. He followed, silent, watching me with an intensity one couldn't read. "You swear at the plants. That's unusual." "They don't listen," I said, tucking my hands behind my back. "And frankly, if they could, I'm certain they would insult me back." Lucen's lips quirked upward, just barely. The kind of small, controlled smile that somehow made my stomach lurch and my brain betray me with heat in the cheeks. "Then they have the right teacher," he said softly. "If anyone could command a rose with threats and profanity, it would be you." I blinked. "Is that a compliment or a warning?" "Both," he replied, eyes sparkling faintly. "Dangerous. Ridiculous. Distracting." I might have swooned if my dignity hadn't been tangled in dirt and rose stems. Noan appeared suddenly from behind a hedgerow, a mischievous grin on his face. "Practicing murder again?" he called out. "I am not murdering roses." I shouted. "Threatening them counts," Noan said solemnly. "And don't even think about touching the tulips. Those are diplomatic flowers. Highly dangerous." Lucen crouched beside me again and whispered, "You're teaching him sarcasm. Dangerous lessons in small doses are essential for survival." I glared at him. "Are you trying to recruit my stepson into some twisted horticultural espionage?" "Merely educational," he replied, brushing his fingers across a thorny branch, careful not to get scratched. I sighed. "Fine. But the thorns remain treacherous. And I will not be responsible if my hand is amputated in service to the garden." He smirked faintly, and I spent the next half hour explaining, muttering, and occasionally gesturing wildly at the roses while he remained calm, collected, and frighteningly confident. He planted seedlings with perfect precision. He pruned dangerous branches with surgical accuracy. He didn't flinch when I accidentally flung dirt onto his sleeve. He just watched. Eventually, he handed me a small rosebud to hold. "Try patience," he said. I stared at the tiny bloom. It was delicate, pinkish, innocent. And yet, holding it made me hyper-aware of his proximity, the warmth of his hand when he adjusted it in my fingers, the faint smell of soil and sandalwood on him. I muttered under my breath, "This is probably dangerous." "You're learning," he said simply. The afternoon drifted by, filled with awkward silences that were somehow intimate. Birds chirped. Bees buzzed. No one rolled around in the grass at a safe distance, pretending not to be entertained by my attempts at gardening while secretly taking notes for some future mischief. "You talk to the roses," Lucen said suddenly. "Aya therapy," I repeated, not trusting my voice to sound confident. "You're improving," he replied. "Tomorrow, we will attempt watering without threat. Then pruning without profanity. Then, we may graduate to hedge sculpting." I groaned audibly. "This is turning into a military campaign." "No," he corrected. "This is survival training." By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting golden light across the garden, I was dirty, exhausted, and a little dizzy from the heat. But for the first time since arriving at this mansion, I felt capable. Strong. Brave, even. Not invincible. Not perfect. Just alive. Lucen stood at the edge of the garden, watching me tend the roses one last time before dusk. He said nothing. I didn't need him to. Somehow, his presence alone was enough to make the day feel different, less like surviving a cursed novel, and more like living a strange, unexpected life. That night, when I drifted into sleep, I dreamed of roses blooming without thorns. Their petals were soft, fragrant, and untouchable only by care, not by danger. And in the dream, Lucen was there too, standing behind me, protective, patient, smiling faintly as if to say, "You can survive this. Together." I woke with the scent of roses in my hair and a strange, unplaceable warmth in my chest. Somewhere, in the mansion, I suspected Lucen was observing silently, just as he had all day. And somehow I didn't mind. Not entirely. Because maybe, just maybe, danger and charm didn't always have to be mutually exclusive. Chapter 9. I began to suspect that my stepson was a genius. Or a maniac. Possibly both. It all started innocently enough. Noan had been unusually quiet all morning, his eyes glinting with secret knowledge, his lips pursed in that way that meant something is coming. The head maid, a sharp-eyed woman named Althea, bent over him as he whispered instructions. I caught fragments: Operation Heart Melting, locked door, candles, book accident. My brain did what it always did in high-stress situations: panicked. "Operation Heart Melting?" I asked cautiously, pretending not to overhear. "Nothing," Noan said, snapping his book shut with a flourish that might have injured a small horse. "Just chores." "Ah, yes. Chores. Chores that apparently involved trapping your parents in a Gothic library with the subtle pressure of confessing love before release." By evening, it became obvious I had underestimated him. The library door clicked. Locked. I twisted the handle. Locked. Lucen stood beside me, casually leaning against the shelves, giving me that perfectly calm, slightly amused look that made my pulse perform acrobatics. "Your son is becoming dangerously creative," I hissed, crossing my arms. "He takes after you," Lucen replied, voice low, as though that statement alone contained a threat and a compliment simultaneously. I had no idea how to feel. "Excuse me," I said. "Dangerous creativity is not a hereditary trait." He didn't respond. Just tilted his head, a single eyebrow raising, watching me like he was both impressed and entertained. I realized then, yes, I was absolutely combusting internally. Minutes passed. Then hours. Noan's voice drifted from outside the locked door. "You can come out when you've confessed your feelings." I spun toward Lucen, incredulous. He's become a tiny romantic dictator. I'm honored, Lucen said calmly, one hand brushing along the spines of old books. I take it as a compliment that he believes we have feelings to confess. Or he thinks we're idiots, I muttered, glaring at him. He smiled faintly, and I had to resist the urge to throw a book at his head. With nothing to do but wait, we settled into an awkward companionship. The library was large, echoing, filled with the scent of old paper, polished wood, and faint traces of candle wax. I sat cross-legged on the floor while Lucen leaned against a tall shelf, arms folded. We talked. About everything and nothing. His late nights in the study, reading letters from distant relatives. My recurring nightmares, where roses gleamed red under unnatural moonlight. The peculiar smell of ink on old parchment. The way the cat had adopted me as its personal throne. At some point, I joked, unable to resist the dangerous impulse, your face is annoyingly divine. He looked at me, eyebrows lifting ever so slightly. I'll take that as a compliment, he said smoothly, like he hadn't heard the faint sting intended. Don't. It was an insult, I replied immediately. He smiled anyway. That maddening, faint smile. My brain decided to short-circuit. Hours stretched. Candles flickered. Shadows danced across the high shelves, exaggerating the angles of his jaw, the sweep of his dark hair, the slight curve of his lips. Somehow, under the pretense of being trapped by a mischievous child, the library became intimate. Not too intimate, not romantic in the conventional sense, but something sharper and warmer than the cold mansion outside. I debated loudly in my head whether to punch Noen, faint dramatically, or confess feelings simply to escape. Eventually, there was a click. The door swung open. Noen appeared, triumphant, a small key dangling from a ribbon around his neck. You two may leave, he declared, hands on his hips. And next time, I expect more emotion. Lucen straightened, brushing dust from his sleeve, and said casually, Thank you for improving communication, Noen. Very productive exercise. Noen gave a small bow, eyes sparkling. You're welcome. Mission accomplished. I wanted to collapse dramatically onto the floor in a mix of relief and embarrassment, but instead, I muttered, that child is going to be the end of me someday. Lucen leaned closer, voice quiet, deadly calm, and whispered, Perhaps he's just preparing you both for the inevitable. One day, the two of you will need courage, honesty, and chaos. I flushed bright red, partly at the implication and partly at the way his proximity made me hyper-aware of every nerve ending in my body. Noen, noticing our quiet exchange, whispered, I heard that. Don't tell anyone, especially the roses. Then he scurried off before either of us could react. I groaned. He's plotting something new already. You don't think he'd make a breakfast trap next? Lucen's lips quirked slightly. I imagine that would be very educational. And probably entertaining. I groaned again. You're encouraging him. This is why chaos will always triumph over sanity. I prefer to call it training, Lucen said, eyes glinting in the candlelight. He's teaching resilience. You should thank him. Thank him. I squeaked. I nearly confessed feelings in a library. Do you know what this means for my dignity? Lucen simply smiled. That small, dangerous smile that made me want to simultaneously punch him and hug him. He didn't comment further. Just leaned back and watched the flickering candlelight, giving me space to stew in my embarrassment. By the time we left the library, night had fallen. The mansion was quiet, the wind whispering through the corridors, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear Noen snickering. I realized that despite everything, I was smiling. A little. Nervously. Very, very nervously. Lucen walked beside me through the grand halls. He didn't touch me, but his proximity was noticeable. My pulse reminded me that chaos wasn't limited to the library, or to Noen's schemes. It had seeped into the strange, new dynamic forming between the three of us. As I entered my chambers, I muttered to myself, note to self, surviving your stepson's schemes may be more dangerous than surviving the kitchen. And, somehow, far more thrilling. Chapter 10. The Duchy decided to throw me a grand welcome ball, which, in theory, should have been an evening of elegance, music, and polite smiles. In practice, it felt more like being flung into a shark tank wearing a tutu. I would have preferred solitary confinement with a stack of books and a lifetime supply of tea. Or, failing that, a small cave somewhere with no mirrors, no gossiping nobles, and absolutely no floor-length gowns. The hall glittered under countless chandeliers, each crystal refracting light like tiny, judgmental stars. Servants in polished uniforms flitted past, carrying trays of sparkling punch and canapes that looked far too delicate to be eaten without incident. My gown was a pale, shimmering blue, with layers of silk and lace that threatened to suffocate me with every step. Someone had insisted on gloves, long and satin smooth. They made it impossible to hold my wine glass properly. And the nobles, oh, the nobles. Half the room was already murmuring. Whispers floated across the polished floors like tiny, venomous ribbons. Adopted. Low birth. Poor thing. I counted 4 aristocrats glaring at me in what I assumed was perfect unison. I took a deep breath and tried to smile, which was harder than it sounded. Smiling when your knees are weak, your hands are sweaty in silk gloves, and your heart is hammering like a runaway carriage requires serious skill. A skill I had not yet mastered. I debated the merits of tripping someone deliberately. Preferably one of the whispering ladies, or maybe the tall gentleman with a smug smirk. Revenge, after all, was a subtle art, and tonight felt like the perfect occasion to practice. Then he appeared. Lucen. Tall, dark, immaculate, every inch the untouchable Duke Lucen. He didn't walk. He glided across the hall, and somehow, despite the crowded room, he seemed entirely alone. Nobles parted instinctively, like water around a rock, as though he carried some invisible force field. He stopped beside me, just close enough that I could feel the faint scent of him: sandalwood, leather, and something else I couldn't name, but which made my stomach do complicated gymnastics. A lady nearby, perfectly coiffed and dripping with diamonds, sneered at me. "Your Grace has peculiar taste," she said, clearly attempting to insult me and failing spectacularly. Lucen's voice carried through the hall, calm, clear, and dangerously authoritative. "The title of Duchess suits only her." The words were like a bell tolling through the room. Silence fell. Nobles stopped mid-conversation, the orchestra hesitated mid-note, and I felt my knees go weak. Did he just? I whispered to myself, trembling slightly. Yes. He just did, no one muttered from behind a pillar, watching with rapt interest and clearly enjoying my discomfort. After that, the whispers changed. I was still the adopted, low-born outsider, but now, apparently, I was the Duchess everyone would envy or fear. People curtsied, bowed, or otherwise pretended I was somehow untouchable. I, on the other hand, treated Lucen like a live grenade. Every time our eyes met across the hall, my stomach fluttered so treacherously that I wondered if I might spontaneously combust. Dinner arrived, a parade of elaborate dishes that I didn't recognize and didn't trust. Soup that smelled vaguely like perfume. Fish that glimmered like it had escaped from a crystal aquarium. I took tiny bites, trying to maintain the dignified air of a duchess, while internally plotting how to survive the evening. "Try not to choke," Lucen murmured, leaning just close enough that his voice brushed my ear. His lips were terrifyingly near. My pulse betrayed me. "Or if you do," he added with that faint smirk, "make it look graceful." I gave him a look that could have wilted a flower. He didn't flinch. He just smiled faintly. The rest of the evening was a blur of polite conversation, subtle glances, and whispered comments from Noen, who clearly considered himself our overseer in operation, make stepmother and father not drown in embarrassment. At one point, he whispered loudly enough for me to hear, "Father looks nervous. Use this." I promptly choked on a canopy. Lucen, ever composed, subtly handed me a glass of water without a word, fingers brushing mine in a way that set off alarms in my chest. My blush was probably visible from space. The peak of disaster, no, the peak of dramatic hilarity came when one overly eager guest tried to comment on my poor upbringing. I was poised to trip her on the carpet when Lucen intervened. He didn't shout. He didn't scold. He simply said, voice low, measured, and lethal in its calmness, "She is the Duchess. You will address her as such." The room froze. The guest nearly fainted. I nearly fainted. And Lucen stood there, impossibly tall, impossibly composed, every inch the man I wasn't supposed to survive encounters with, protecting me with terrifying elegance. By the end of the night, when the music slowed and the chandeliers dimmed, Lucen offered his arm. "Did I overstep?" he asked quietly, as if merely offering his arm was a dangerous maneuver. "You ruined my plan to remain invisible," I muttered, stepping into his embrace with a mixture of dignity and despair. "Then I'll apologize tomorrow," he said, voice teasingly calm. He didn't. Instead, the next morning, I found roses outside my door. Blue ones. Glowing faintly under the moonlight, as if the stars themselves had decided to participate in my humiliation and, perhaps, my heart's treacherous fluttering. I stared at them, wondering if I should cry, laugh, or hide under the covers. I did a little of all three. No one watched from the hallway, smirking. They're pretty, aren't they? Yes, I said, cautiously, reaching out to touch one. Its petals were soft, luminescent, and almost magical. But I don't trust him. Of course not, no one said knowingly. He's your father figure and also your doom. I glared at him, but secretly, I couldn't stop myself from smiling. Somehow, despite all the whispers, all the chaos, all the dangerous glances and glowing roses, I felt alive. Alive in a way that was terrifying, delightful, and entirely out of my control. I tucked the roses into a vase, careful to arrange them just so, and muttered, "You may have won this round, Lucen dareth Rion. But the war has only begun." Somewhere, in the depths of that massive mansion, I suspected he was watching, and I suspected he was smiling. And I didn't entirely mind. Chapter 11. It was supposed to be a normal morning. Breakfast, light reading, maybe a little gardening if I was feeling brave, and most importantly pretending that I wasn't panicking about everything in my new, impossibly complicated life. But the universe, apparently, had other plans. I was wandering the corridors of the Rion mansion, trying to memorize a route that wouldn't get me lost, when my gaze fell upon a gilded frame in the corner of a sunlit hallway. I froze mid-step, mouth slightly open, because inside that frame was a woman who could have been my twin. Same honey-colored curls, same almond-shaped eyes, same delicate curve of the jaw that apparently defined Duchess DNA. I yelped. Not a polite squeak. Not a hushed gasp. A full-on, catastrophic nope. Nope. Nope kind of yelp. The sound echoed down the corridor and, I was certain, set off some small domestic alarm somewhere in the house. The painting was titled elegantly beneath the frame, Lady Celine dareth Rion, First Duchess of Rion. I stared, frozen, as the universe cruelly leaned closer. Lady Celine. Late wife of Lucen. Doomed in the novel, elegantly tragic, probably killed in a manner that would make my nightmares look like a cozy afternoon nap. And now, her uncanny doppelganger me was standing mere feet away. I muttered under my breath, pacing backward slowly. Nope. Not happening. I did not sign up for doppelganger drama today. A voice behind me, calm and measured, made me jump like a startled rabbit. You've met my late wife? I spun. Lucen stood there, hands behind his back, perfectly composed as ever, dark eyes observing me with what I suspected was equal parts curiosity and amusement. Yes, I said carefully, eyeing the painting again. And I think she's plotting against me. He didn't laugh. That lack of laughter somehow made it more terrifying than a roar of mockery. He stepped closer under the pretense of examining the painting, but the brush of his hand against mine, accidental or otherwise, made my pulse betray me, skipping a beat and then doubling it. I waved a hand to clear the air, because obviously, my flustered heartbeat was not suitable for public display. I mean, not really. Maybe. Possibly she's a ghost. Or a vengeful spirit. Either way, I'm terrified. Lucen's eyebrow quirked, a faint, precise arch that somehow suggested amusement, judgment, and mild concern simultaneously. It would be unreasonable to be terrified of my late wife, he said softly, if only because she's passed. I glared at him. That's not comforting. And also, how did you know I was terrified? Observation, he replied simply. Then he gestured toward the painting. She was remarkable. Loyal, clever, perhaps a little dramatic. I leaned closer, whispering conspiratorially to the painting. Don't worry. I'm not here to compete. Promise. Mostly. Later that afternoon, as I wandered down another hallway in an attempt to escape the gaze of the life-sized portrait, whispers began to float through the corridors like malicious, elegant ghosts. The new Duchess. Uncanny resemblance. Unlucky fate, surely. I nearly fell over on my own slippers. Unlucky fate? That was my line. I rounded a corner and bumped into Noen, who was conveniently or not hiding behind a velvet curtain. He snickered. See? The mansion approves of your panic. Or the portrait does. Either way, you're officially terrifying. I pinched the bridge of my nose. I'm not terrifying. I'm cautious. And also not dead. Yet? Noen's grin widened. Yet, he says. Very dramatic, Lady Eira. You fit right in. By mid-afternoon, I'd attempted to drown my existential panic in tea and biscuits, but Lucen appeared again, suddenly, standing by the window with his arms crossed, staring at the courtyard like he was guarding it from invisible enemies. You're still thinking about her, he said softly. Might be, I admitted, stirring my tea with far too much force, sending a sugar lump tumbling onto the table. It's hard not to think about someone who looks exactly like you and died horribly in a book I read once. He moved closer, leaning against the edge of the table. She was nothing like the story says. I assure you, she was alive in ways you haven't imagined. I frowned. So, maybe I shouldn't panic? Maybe, he said slowly, but caution is understandable. We lapsed into silence, interrupted only by the faint ticking of a clock, the distant murmur of the servants, and my own wildly beating heart. I wanted to ask him so many questions, but couldn't. Every time I opened my mouth, my brain betrayed me, sending a surge of warmth and panic in equal measure. Later, as I wandered the corridors, I caught snippets of conversation between maids and footmen. Lady Eira. She resembles the late Duchess too closely, don't you think? Yes. And the stories, the tragedies. I hope she's luckier. I sighed audibly. I hope so too, I muttered to myself. Then I muttered louder, for dramatic effect, or else I might haunt the corridors in silk and sarcasm. Lucen appeared behind me again, silent as a shadow. You're speaking to yourself now? Yes, I replied boldly. And also possibly to the portrait of your late wife, who may or may not be plotting against me. He didn't laugh, didn't scold, didn't roll his eyes. He simply nodded, as though that explanation made perfect sense. Then speak wisely, he said, voice low, and remember, some ghosts are only in stories, others, only in perception. I glanced at him, realizing the words applied equally to the late Duchess, no one scheming, and him. By nightfall, the whispers had grown into rumors circulating among the servants and minor nobles. Some were curious, some were fearful, some clearly wondered if I was a reincarnation of the late Duchess. And somewhere in the mansion, I imagined Lady Celine's portrait watching, judging, perhaps plotting subtle revenge. I poured a glass of wine, muttering under my breath, do not ruin my life, painted ghost. I've survived kitchens, libraries, and glowing roses. You will not best me in the psychological warfare department. Lucen appeared once more, leaning casually against the doorframe. She's only a portrait, he said, voice calm, though his eyes betrayed a faint curiosity. And yet, I suspect she might be your greatest rival in etiquette and sarcasm. I narrowed my eyes. Rival? In what? Looking pretty well dead. He smiled faintly. Perhaps. Or maybe in keeping me awake at night. I nearly choked on my wine. What how? He raised a hand in mock innocence. Observation, Lady Eira. One must always be aware of ghosts in the house, painted or otherwise. I glared, muttered something about wine being insufficient protection against painted rivals, and settled down in my chair, exhausted but secretly exhilarated. Somehow, the late Duchess, her whispers through the corridors, and Lucen's quiet presence had made my day. Thrilling. And terrifying. Mostly thrilling. Chapter 12. I had a simple goal that afternoon. Survive the roses. Literally survive. After the whole painting fiasco and whispers about the late Duchess, I decided it was time to confront the greenhouse, the very place where, according to the book, my predecessor had met her untimely demise. The air was warm, humid, and smelled like wet soil, petals, and a hint of something faintly magical. The glass panes overhead reflected sunlight in dizzying patterns, and the roses themselves glimmered in reds, pinks, and deep violet. It was beautiful, but my mind insisted on focusing only on the part where roses were supposedly murderously enchanted. I knelt down, gloves smudged with soil, muttering encouragements to myself. Try killing me now, you thorny monsters, I whispered. It wasn't therapy, exactly, it was a pep talk, bordering on a pep argument with myself. I had just bent over to prune a particularly suspicious-looking rosebush when the ground beneath me shuddered. A shelf, a tall, wobbly shelf stacked with pots and gardening tools, creaked ominously. I froze. Then it collapsed. Glass shards flew like deadly confetti. The room erupted into chaos. I shrieked, arms flailing, dodging shards and overturned pots. Somewhere, a potted fern rolled across the floor like it was fleeing the scene of the crime. And then he was there. Lucen. Calm, impossibly tall, hair slightly mussed, eyes narrowed with that infuriatingly composed expression that suggested he had expected exactly this. Except, in this version of events, he was bleeding from a shallow cut on his forearm, likely from the falling glass. Yet there he was, crouched beside me, effortlessly scooping me up as if I weighed no more than a feather. You're impossible, he muttered, voice low, carrying both amusement and mild reprimand. I'm alive, I panted, trying to wiggle free but failing miserably. Mostly. And slightly cut. Possibly traumatized. Mostly alive is acceptable, he said. Trauma can be treated. As he carried me out of the greenhouse, my hands automatically went to his chest, partly to steady myself, partly because I was panicking, and partly because apparently my brain had decided that this was a hugging emergency. I froze mid-thought. No, don't think like that. He's bleeding. He's dangerous. Stop thinking about how his hair smells like leather and sandalwood, and oh no, I'm thinking about that. We reached the garden path, sunlight hitting us in rays that made him look impossibly heroic. He set me down gently on a bench, and I finally noticed the small cut on his arm. Oh, you're bleeding, I said instinctively, reaching out. He looked at me with a faint smirk. So you do care. I recoiled slightly. I care about surviving, I said firmly and truthfully for half a second, before adding a mental footnote. Half-lies are acceptable. Especially when the truth terrifies you. You care terribly about surviving, he muttered, brushing dirt from his sleeve. Yet here you are, kneeling in a greenhouse that wants to kill you. Fascinating. I glared. It's gardening. I'm improving myself. And possibly fighting fate. Lucen shook his head, eyes softening just slightly. Then you're braver than most. And more stubborn than any rose I've ever seen. We paused, briefly, in that odd suspended moment between disaster and recovery. I wanted to say something clever, witty, or profound, but all that escaped my lips was a strangled, so, the culprit? He glanced around the greenhouse with careful precision, scanning for anything out of place. Unknown. Someone intended this to happen. Timing, placement, deliberate. Whoever it was knew exactly when you'd be here. My stomach flipped. Someone is trying to kill me. Again. Yes, he said softly. And apparently, they're persistent. I hugged my knees to my chest. I hate this mansion. I hate this story. He crouched beside me, lowering himself to my level. The small cut on his arm glinted in the sunlight. My fingers twitched toward it, not consciously, but instinctively. He noticed. You're worrying unnecessarily, he said, brushing the tip of his thumb over the shallow wound. The gesture was so gentle, so precise, so infuriatingly intimate that I nearly lost my balance. My pulse went rogue, announcing my internal panic to the world. I can handle it, I stammered, feeling like a foolish schoolgirl in the presence of a very, very intimidating man. Perhaps, he said quietly. But sometimes, one does not have to handle everything alone. Even if that includes surviving homicidal roses. I stared at him. Did he just flirt with me while injured? My internal monologue spun dangerously out of control. No one, naturally, decided that this was the perfect moment for his dramatic entrance. He appeared at the greenhouse door, arms crossed, expression smug. Finally, he announced. I knew someone would almost die, and I wanted front row seats. Did you survive? Yes? Excellent. I groaned. He's encouraging this, I muttered under my breath. Lucen didn't flinch. He has a point. Observation is part of his training, he said, voice carefully neutral, though the corners of his mouth twitched slightly. I wanted to throw a rose at him. A small, thorny one. Something that communicated frustration and terror simultaneously. After Noen departed, leaving us with our mild injuries and mutual embarrassment, I finally sank onto the bench. The greenhouse, though partially ruined, smelled faintly of wet earth and danger. Lucen sat beside me, silent for a long moment. The warmth of his presence was undeniable, though I tried to ignore it, citing protocol and survival instinct. You did well, he said softly, looking down at me. Most people would have panicked entirely. You adapted. I made a face. I screamed. Constantly. And I nearly died. He chuckled, low and amused. Details. I wanted to punch him. Instead, I muttered, the culprit is still out there. Yes, he agreed. And we'll find them. Together. The word together made me catch my breath. Partly from relief, partly from something else I refused to name. We finally returned to the mansion, and I couldn't help but glance back at the greenhouse, remembering the shards of glass, the toppled shelves, and the faint, lingering chill in the air. Whoever had engineered that attack wasn't done. And neither, I suspected, was my story. I brushed dirt from my gloves and whispered to myself, note to self, survive horticultural attacks. Protect Lucen. Possibly interrogate suspicious roses. Lucen, apparently reading my thoughts or simply reading me, gave a faint, approving nod. And, perhaps, Enjoy the moments when you're not being endangered. I blinked at him. You make it sound almost fun. Almost, he said, standing gracefully. For now, the greenhouse is secure. But life, he added quietly, has a way of repeating itself. Especially in stories like ours. I shivered, not entirely from cold. Somehow, the mansion, the roses, the whispered plots, and Lucen's presence had transformed fear into anticipation. Terrifying, exhilarating anticipation. And in that moment, I realized something. My previous life's death wasn't just a warning, it was a challenge. And I, Eira Valenrion, was going to rewrite the ending. Chapter 13. I had just settled into a rare moment of domestic bliss, by which I mean Noen was quietly reading a book instead of plotting world domination or locking his parents in a library, and the universe decided to test me again. The test came in the form of Countess Morel. She arrived one crisp afternoon, sweeping into the Rion mansion like a storm cloud carrying its own personal thunder. I had heard stories about her, elegant, polished, impossibly perfect, and apparently allergic to humility. She was Lucen's former fiancé, which meant my life had just become a tightrope walk across a canyon of charm, threat, and potential disaster. The doors of the great hall opened, and she glided in, tall, immaculate, and radiating disdain like a perfume one couldn't escape. Every noble in the room seemed to pause, holding their breath for either admiration or the inevitable disaster. I swallowed hard, straightened my back, and reminded myself, you survived a greenhouse collapse. You can survive a courtly storm. Her eyes swept over me, sharp as a knife. You're just a charity bride, I hear, she said, voice smooth but dripping venom. I felt a prickle in my cheeks, half from nerves, half from sheer irritation. My mind worked frantically, weighing options: flee, hide, trip her with a subtle twist of silk, or respond with a verbal jab that would leave her speechless. I chose the last. And yet you're still single, I said, tilting my head innocently. Must be the personality. There was a pause. A long, uncomfortable pause. Then I heard it. A faint, deep chuckle behind me. Listen. Standing there, hands behind his back, watching me like a general observing a new recruit. He didn't intervene. He didn't shake his head. He just laughed quietly, the sound low and impossible to ignore. It traveled through the hall and somehow hit me directly in the chest. My pulse jumped. Focus, Eira. You're in the middle of a verbal duel. Morel's lips curled, tight and thin, and she gave me a look that suggested she was deciding whether to destroy me or my reputation, or possibly both. She began, then faltered. Her poise wavered for just a second, and I knew I'd scored a small victory. A very, very satisfying victory. I allowed myself the tiniest smirk, feeling dangerously smug. Shall I introduce you to the garden? I asked sweetly, gesturing toward the greenhouse. It's lovely this time of year. Very thorny. Her eyes flickered toward the glass structure, and I swear I saw a hint of unease, tiny, almost imperceptible, but it thrilled me. Lucen finally spoke, stepping slightly forward, his expression perfectly neutral. Countess Morel, he said, voice smooth as silk but firm as steel. I hope your visit is pleasant. Pleasant, yes, she said, a little too sharply. Though I see the new Duchess has settled in quite quickly. Settled, I echoed, grinning, or survived. There's a difference. Her hand twitched toward the fan at her side, a classic aristocratic reflex when one is attempting to maintain composure under duress. I fought the urge to clap quietly for my own cleverness. Noen, ever the tactician, appeared at my elbow with a whispered comment. Stepmother wins again. I ruffled his hair affectionately. Victory is mine, for now, I whispered back, realizing that this was only the opening skirmish in what was clearly going to be an ongoing war of wits and wills. The next few hours were a blur of subtle jabs, forced politeness, and the occasional whispered commentary from Noen. Morel tried everything: pointed compliments that doubled as insults, forced smiles that froze halfway across her face, and casual remarks meant to highlight my inadequacies as a duchess. I countered with small, precise barbs, polite, elegant, but cutting. At one point, she tried to corner me near the refreshments table, gesturing toward a particularly elaborate display of pastries. I hope these are suitable for someone of your standing, she said, clearly attempting to insult both my birth and my culinary sensibilities. I leaned closer, voice silky but sharp. They're divine. And I'm sure one day, with enough practice, you'll learn to appreciate them. Her eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected such a direct reply. I felt a thrill of vindication. Lucen's faint, amused smile in my peripheral vision only made it sweeter. Later, during the evening's waltz, Morel tried to corner Lucen, positioning herself for a dance and some subtle charm offensive. I, naturally, refused to be sidelined. I stepped in with a polite but firm suggestion, "May I have this dance, Your Grace?" Lucen looked at me, expression neutral, then extended his hand. "Of course." Morel's face tightened into a mask of fury as Lucen's hand met mine, guiding me across the ballroom floor with that infuriating calmness that always made me forget to breathe properly. "Step lightly," he murmured, voice low, "and try not to step on the Countess's ego. She's delicate." I stifled a laugh, though my pulse was still erratic. "Noted. I'll save the stomping for emergencies." The dance ended and Morel, clearly defeated for the evening, retreated with as much dignity as she could muster. She left fuming, head held high but eyes narrowed in silent war. I allowed myself a quiet, private victory dance behind a curtain, just to celebrate. Noen appeared shortly after, applauding with genuine enthusiasm. "Stepmother wins again," he whispered, grinning from ear to ear. I ruffled his hair and kissed the top of his head. "Yes, victory is mine, for now. But mark my words, dear boy, she'll be back. And next time, she might bring more than just haughty insults." Noen's grin widened. "Then we'll be ready. Operation Protect Stepmother is officially in effect." I laughed softly, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with roses or the greenhouse and everything to do with family, my new, chaotic, slightly terrifying family. As the evening wound down, Lucen approached, standing just behind me. "You handled that exceptionally well," he said quietly. I turned slightly, meeting his gaze, heart fluttering. I didn't want to embarrass myself or us, especially with the Countess watching. "You didn't embarrass yourself," he said, voice calm but loaded with a weight that made my stomach twist. "You proved that you belong here. More than you realize." I blinked, unsure whether to laugh, blush, or panic. Probably all three. I opted for a shaky smile. "I suppose surviving your former fiancé's wrath counts as experience?" "It counts as courage," he replied, almost tenderly. "And cunning. You're learning quickly, Lady Eira." I felt my chest tighten with a mixture of pride and something I refused to name. He turned, walking away with that infuriatingly perfect composure, leaving me simultaneously triumphant and flustered. Noen tugged my sleeve. "So, can we celebrate with cake now?" I smiled, ruffling his hair again. "Yes, but only because cake is a neutral ground. And maybe because you deserve it after enduring this drama." As I followed him to the dessert table, I couldn't help but glance toward the door where Morel had exited. She'd retreated for now, but I knew she'd return. The game was far from over. Still, for tonight, I felt victorious. I had survived a verbal duel, a test of nerves, and the dangerous presence of a former fiancé. And, most importantly, I had managed it without fainting, throwing a pastry, or completely melting into Lucen's dangerously calm presence. Victory, I decided, tasted sweeter than any cake in the room. And I intended to savor every crumb. Chapter 14 Curiosity. I reminded myself as I crept toward Lucen's study, is a dangerous thing. And yet, here I was, tiptoeing through the polished corridors of the Rion mansion like some amateur spy. The house was quiet. Noen had been safely dispatched to the library, and the maids were preoccupied with polishing the endless silverware collection that seemed to multiply every week. I paused outside Lucen's study, hand on the doorknob, hesitating. The door was ajar, as if inviting me in. I could feel my pulse spiking. This was forbidden territory. The private domain of the Duke of Rion. The man whose reputation could freeze hearts and command kingdoms with a glance. Still, curiosity won. Always curiosity. I slid the door open, careful not to make a sound, and stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of leather, ink, and something uniquely Lucen, an unplaceable blend of authority and quiet danger. The desk was immaculate except for one small stack of papers bound with a crimson ribbon. My heart did a little leap. I hesitated. Should I touch them? Could I be caught? Was this considered espionage in Duchess law? I had no idea. I pushed the thought aside and reached for the bundle. The ribbon came off easily, and the letters inside looked old. Very old. Ink faded, edges worn. And then I read the first line. "To whom it may concern, Duke Lucen Dareth Rion is innocent of all charges concerning the death of Lady Erilyn Rion." My stomach did a double flip. My mouth went dry. Lady Erilyn. The late Duchess. The woman who had apparently died under mysterious circumstances, leaving Lucen with a reputation as cold, detached, and potentially lethal. I sank into the chair, letters trembling in my hands. As I read, the story unfolded like a hidden map, a conspiracy, carefully orchestrated by distant relatives hungry for inheritance. Rumors spread in hushed whispers and, most damningly, forged evidence that had almost ruined him. Lucen had been framed, not a killer at all. I leaned back, absorbing the enormity of the revelation. The man I had been so terrified of, whose mere presence had caused my pulse to misbehave, whose quiet strength had been both a curse and a comfort, wasn't a villain at all. He was human. Vulnerable, strategic, and quietly heroic. I couldn't help the soft gasp that escaped my lips. Just like that, my mental narrative crumbled. All those fears, the anticipation of betrayal, the anxious calculations of how to survive marriage, most of it had been based on a lie. And yet, there he was, raising Noen with care, navigating the treacherous waters of nobility, while silently seeking the truth. The letters detailed his tireless investigation, evidence collected in secret, people he had confronted delicately and firmly, all to uncover the real culprit. It was meticulous, brave, almost unbearably noble. I felt a strange heat rise in my chest. Was this admiration? Relief? Something more dangerous, something like affection? I shoved the thought aside, reminding myself that survival came first. Then I noticed a smaller bundle tucked beneath the first letters. These were different. Personal. Written in a hand that was unmistakably Lucen's own. Noen, you are my son, and though life has been unfair, you are the truth I protect. I hope the world does not teach you bitterness, only strength, courage, and love. I froze. Lucen wasn't just a duke investigating a past wrong. He was a father, devoted in quiet ways that rarely made the headlines or the gossip columns. My chest tightened. Raising Noen had been, up until now, my responsibility. But here was evidence that Lucen, too, had been quietly, carefully shaping a child's life. A swell of emotion struck me, something like awe mixed with guilt. I had been so wrapped up in my fears, my plans to survive, my sarcastic mental commentary on doomed duchesses, that I hadn't paused to realize the full human complexity of the man beside me. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't a plot device. He was real. He was everything I had been too scared to admit I wanted to know. The letters also contained clues, hints of meetings he had planned with informants, coded messages left for himself, and even the occasional dry joke hidden in the margins. Always remember, one letter read, that truth often wears a mask, but patience is the key to unmasking it without bloodshed. I laughed softly, the sound shaking the silence of the study. The man who had terrified me, who had inspired panic and awe in equal measure, was also witty and clever in ways I hadn't imagined. My admiration, mingled with relief, was beginning to blossom into something unsettlingly like respect. I lingered over each page, piecing together the story of a life lived in shadow and secrecy. He had carried the weight of false accusations, the weight of a son, and the weight of the expectations of a court that whispered constantly about the doomed Duchess and the cold-hearted Duke. And yet, he bore it all with quiet strength. When I finally set the letters down, my mind was racing. The story I had been trapped in the Duke's dark rose had lied to me. It had painted Lucen as a monster, a villain, a cautionary tale. But the reality, the true narrative hidden beneath layers of deception, was almost unbearably different. Almost heartbreakingly different. I realized then that the universe had handed me an opportunity. A chance not merely to survive, but to rewrite the story. Not just for myself, but for everyone in this household. For Lucen, for Noen, and perhaps even for the spirits of those wronged in the past. I pressed my hand to the letters, feeling the weight of history, truth, and trust all at once. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a tiny voice whispered, "You don't have to be the tragic Duchess. You get to choose." I exhaled slowly, the enormity of the realization settling over me like a warm, protective cloak. Fear had dominated my thoughts for weeks, fear of Lucen, fear of the greenhouse, fear of a story that insisted I would die. But now, with this evidence in my hands, I understood something crucial. The story had been lying, but I wasn't. And if the story wanted to repeat itself, I had the power to interrupt it. I leaned back in the chair, gazing out the window at the gardens where no one played and the sun glinted off the distant rooftops. I felt an unfamiliar sense of calm, tinged with excitement. I was still in a dangerous world, a world filled with secrets, whispers, and potential murderers. But I wasn't helpless. Not anymore. I rose, carefully refolding the letters and placing them in the same neat bundle. Every line, every hint, every word felt like a key to the future. And if I played it right, if I kept my wits about me, if I continued surviving, learning, and growing, then maybe, just maybe, I could take the story that had tried to kill me and turn it into something worth living. And perhaps, if I was lucky, something worth loving. Chapter 15. The rain hit the gardens with relentless determination, like the heavens themselves were scolding me for thinking too much, for overanalyzing every glance, every word, every moment with Lucen. I had fled the house now, fled my own spiraling thoughts into the open, letting the cold drops soak through my skirts and plaster my curls to my face. Mud squelched under my slippers, and I didn't care. I needed air. Fresh, wet, punishingly honest air. And yet, just as I rounded the corner near the rose arbors, those same roses that had threatened to kill me metaphorically and almost literally a few weeks ago, I stumbled into him. Lucen. Drenched from head to toe, hair plastered, sleeves clinging to his arms like wet silk. Calm. Impossibly calm. He looked like some tragic hero from a painting, one who had just stepped out of the storm rather than been caught in it. "You're going to catch a cold," he said softly, his voice carrying over the rain. "I've caught worse," I muttered, shivering. "Mostly panic attacks." He offered me his coat, a heavy, dark piece of fabric that smelled faintly of cedar and warmth. I hesitated, thumb brushing the sleeve, and he tilted his head, patience infinite. "Take it," he said simply. I stepped into it, fumbling, arms awkward, suddenly aware of the closeness, the way the rain made his presence both more imposing and more intimate. I could feel the heat from his body, the faint scent of wet leather and his cologne or whatever subtle magic the universe had chosen to bless him with. "You're nothing like the man in my memories," I admitted suddenly, voice louder than intended. The words startled even me, but I had to say them. He wasn't the cruel, plotting villain of the novel, the one who had haunted my dreams and fueled my paranoid survival strategies. He was alive, breathing, complex, gentle in ways I hadn't expected. "Good," he murmured, brushing rain from a strand of hair that had fallen across my face. His touch lingered a second longer than necessary, and I wanted to move away, yet found myself rooted in place. "I want to be the one you remember next time." I blinked, caught somewhere between disbelief and the fluttering sensation in my chest that I refused to name. For once, my internal monologue, the sarcastic, panicky, self-preserving part of me, was silent. Even Noan's commentary would have been welcome, just to break the tension, but he wasn't here. Just the two of us and the rain and the scent of wet roses. I swallowed, shivering in his coat. "Next time." "Yes," he said. "Next time." "I refuse to be a shadow in your story. If there's a story, it will be the one we write together, not one someone else dictates." I laughed softly, a little breathless. "You make it sound easy." "It's not easy," he admitted, voice low. "Nothing worth it ever is." We walked in silence then, rain soaking us both, feet squelching in the muddy paths between the flower beds. The roses glistened, petals heavy with droplets, and I realized I had never seen them so alive. Perhaps I had been too busy fearing them before. Or fearing life. Or fearing him. "Do you ever get scared?" I asked suddenly, curiosity mingled with caution. He glanced at me, a faint shadow passing across his otherwise unreadable expression. "Every day," he admitted. "But fear isn't a sentence. It's a warning. And it reminds me who and what I'm protecting. Who and what matters." I glanced up at him, heart hammering. He wasn't speaking of the roses, clearly. Not entirely. "I think I get that now," I said quietly, almost to myself. "I've been running from the story, from your supposed cruelty, from my own instincts, and maybe I didn't see what was real." "Reality," he said softly, "is messy. Stories make it neat. But neat rarely survives outside the page." I couldn't stop the small laugh that escaped me, though it was tinged with nerves. "Then we're both living dangerously." He stopped walking and turned to face me, eyes dark and unreadable, rain running down his temples, wet lashes clinging. "Maybe," he said. "But some things are worth the risk." I didn't reply. Words failed me in a way I wasn't used to. I only stared, trying to catch my breath, trying to decide whether I was terrified or something dangerously close to exhilarated. Then he took my hand, brushing water from my sleeve with a gentleness that made my knees weaken. "Eira," he said, voice soft but steady, "you've rewritten more than the story. You've rewritten me." I nearly tripped on my own feet, and he studied me effortlessly. What does that even mean?" I asked, breathless. "It means," he said, voice almost a whisper, that because of you, I'm no longer the man the book says I am. I'm someone better, someone real. I felt warmth flood my chest, a mixture of panic, disbelief, and something else I wasn't naming. Someone better? I repeated, because somehow saying it aloud made it more terrifying. Because you survived, he said. Because you refused to play the role, refused to die on someone else's page. You changed the story. I blinked. My heart was thundering. So, I'm rewriting the story, and you are letting me. He smiled faintly, an expression that made me want to memorize every curve of his lips. Not letting. Choosing. Choosing you. Choosing us. I choked back a laugh, half of disbelief, half of joy. That's audacious. Perhaps, he said, but necessary. The rain softened, lightening to a drizzle, and I realized the garden wasn't just wet, it was alive. Alive with colors brighter than I had remembered, scents sharper, and the quiet whisper of life going on around us. The universe felt less like an enemy and more like a collaborator, albeit one with a wicked sense of humor. I tilted my head, studying him. You really mean that? I do, he said. Every word. Every promise. And for the first time, I believed him. We walked back toward the mansion, still dripping, still shivering, but somehow lighter than we had been moments ago. The story I had feared, the story that had tried to trap me, scare me, and dictate my fate was no longer a threat. It was background noise. The real story was here. In the rain-soaked garden. In our quiet, reckless honesty. In the hand I held in mine. No one met us at the door, face bright. Mom, Dad, did you fight the storm? I looked at Lucen, who offered a small shrug that made my chest ache. We survived, he said simply. Yes, I agreed, a smile tugging at my lips. We survived. And as the fire crackled in the hearth later that evening, I realized something remarkable. Surviving the story might mean more than just staying alive. It might mean finally learning to live. With him. And maybe, just maybe, loving the story we created together. Chapter 16. I should have known something was off the moment the masked figure appeared at the garden gate. One minute, I was admiring the bluebells, muttering to myself about the absurdity of surviving a rainstorm with my dignity intact, and the next, I was yanked into the shadows. Hey, what get off me? I screamed, flailing like a particularly frantic octopus. The figure's voice was cold, deliberate, and dripping with menace. You should have died like before. I hit the person squarely in the chest. Not my finest moment. My aim was questionable, but it worked. They staggered back slightly. Of course, I muttered, squinting through the darkness. This happens in the middle of the chapter where I almost admit feelings. Perfect timing. They lunged again. I kicked, punched, and improvised every curse I knew, some in English, some in French, a few that might not even exist. Surprisingly, yelling, "You picked the wrong Duchess," seemed to make them hesitate. I didn't know why, but I filed it under things that might work in a crisis. I tripped. Stupidly. Over a root. And the masked figure grabbed me, hoisting me off the ground. My skirts twisted around me like a trap, mud squishing between my toes. You're going to regret this. I yelled, because apparently, yelling was my plan now. Silence, the voice said, eerily calm. You will come quietly. I gave a little snort. Quietly? You clearly don't know me. I'm allergic to quiet, calm, or reason. A swift movement, and my wrist was pinched painfully. I winced. This was not going according to my imaginary training montage. My hands went searching for anything I could use. A nearby branch? A flower pot? Maybe the mask itself. Who are you? I demanded, teeth clenched. What do you want from me? And please, at least have the courtesy to reveal your tragic villain origin story. Masked figures are predictable, you know. The figure growled, something I imagined was frustration or maybe amusement. You are a complication I did not anticipate. I paused, cocking my head. Complication. I repeated. Are you talking about me? Because I am full of complications. Just ask my marriage contract. They didn't respond. Good. That gave me a moment to scan my surroundings. We were near the edge of the forest, bordering the Rion estate. Trees loomed, leaves slick with rain, branches whipping around like skeletal hands. Perfect for a dramatic kidnapping scene. Totally normal for my life. I thought about calling for help, but realized shouting, "Listen, rescue me," probably wouldn't help much. He had a habit of showing up after the dramatic climax. I needed to survive this on my own, or at least by time. Then inspiration struck. I remembered the small pouch of peppermints I kept in my pocket purely for morale. Desperate, I jammed one in my mouth and chomped down hard, deliberately trying to chew with exaggerated force. The figure flinched. Not much, but enough. I elbowed them in the stomach, followed by a flurry of kicks. I may have screamed, "This is your last chance," repeatedly, mostly for effect, but also because I genuinely feared for my life. Somehow, in this chaos, my internal monologue added, "You're terrifyingly resourceful for someone who almost burned a kitchen down." The masked figure tightened their grip. "Enough games," they hissed. "The story wants you dead." I snorted, which was clearly a bad idea. The story can want me dead, but I refuse to cooperate. I am a free agent, villain face. You picked the wrong Duchess. We stumbled deeper into the forest. Rain soaked my hair and clothes, and mud clung to me in increasingly uncomfortable patches. I considered screaming for no end, but then realized the child had a strict "don't get involved in adult nonsense" policy. I'd be on my own. My mind raced. I had a choice: panic, faint, or improvise like my life depended on it because, spoiler alert, it did. I opted for the last. I twisted in the figure's grip, wiggling furiously. They cursed under their breath, and I felt a faint crackle of hope. Then, somewhere in the distance, I heard the faintest sound of hoofbeats. Could it be? No, probably just dramatic coincidence. But my heart leapt. "Listen," I whispered under my breath. "If you're coming for me, now is the time. If not, I'm improvising murder-suicide negotiations with a masked figure. Your call." The figure growled. "You will regret mocking me." I smirked despite the mud. "Oh, I plan to. Just not today. Today, I'm the unpredictable variable. You'll need a manual to handle me." Then, lightning split the sky, illuminating the forest and the figure. I got my first good look at them, tall, imposing, moving with a deadly precision. But their mask, well, it was elaborate, yes, but slightly off. Amateurishly so, almost like someone had thought dramatic villain looked good in embroidery. I made a mental note to roast them later if I survived. Using the light as a distraction, I kicked, twisted, and finally slipped free from their grasp. My boots sank into the mud as I ran, branches lashing my face, leaves drenching me, but I didn't care. I was free, or at least running toward freedom. Behind me, the masked figure cursed loudly. "Stop her." I laughed, wet and wild. "I don't think so." I sprinted, zigzagging through the forest like some ungainly gazelle. Heart pounding, lungs burning, exhilarated despite myself. I had survived an actual kidnapping. And yes, it was terrifying. But also thrilling. A sudden roar of anger, one I recognized instantly, cut through the rain. "Eira. Listen." Naturally. Perfectly timed, because of course he was. Out of nowhere, he burst through the tree line, sword drawn. Not that it would have helped me survive the mud puddles, but dramatic, very dramatic. The masked figure hesitated. Bad idea. That pause gave me a chance to trip them in the mud, sending them sprawling. I didn't stop to watch. I dove behind Lucen like some heroic and utterly drenched sidekick. He dispatched the villain quickly, efficiently, and terrifyingly. The masked figure lay on the ground, groaning, defeated by a combination of my improvisation and his absolute calmness. Lucen turned to me, dripping wet, muddy, eyes dark and intense. "Are you all right?" I nodded, catching my breath. "I've had worse mornings," I lied. "Mostly involving fires, broken teapots, and rogue roses." He snorted, the first sound of amusement I'd heard in hours, and offered me his arm. "Then let's go home, Ms. Resilient." I linked my arm through his, mud squelching beneath our boots, rain still dripping from leaves. The forest had tried to kill me, or at least terrify me, but together, we had survived. I had survived. And as we stepped back toward the Rion mansion, I realized something important. The story could try to repeat itself all it wanted. But I wasn't the same person who had been waiting to die in Chapter 28. I was Eira Villain, panicky, sarcastic, and now thoroughly wet but alive. And maybe, just maybe, a little bit ready to live and fight for more than mere survival. Chapter 17. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches scratching at my face and hands as if conspiring with the masked villain to finish what they had started. My skirts were torn, my hair plastered to my cheeks, and my breath came in uneven gasps. I had done my best to stay alive, shouting, elbowing, kicking, but it was clearly not enough. My confidence was slowly being replaced with the kind of panic that usually led to screaming or accidentally flinging a tray of pastries at someone important. And then I heard it. "Listen." His voice cut through the chaos like lightning, low, furious, and raw. "You will not harm her. Not while I draw breath." My heart did that ridiculous hammering thing it always did around him, the same way it had during the rainstorm confession and the kitchen fire fiasco. But now it ached too, a pang that reminded me I wasn't panicking for nothing. Someone I genuinely cared about was here, and he was furious. Truly, utterly, terrifyingly furious. The masked figure cursed, spinning toward the sound, but Lucen moved faster than my brain could process. His dark coat flared behind him, boots silent on the damp earth. There was no hesitation in his stride, no polite pause or strategy lecture, just pure feral intensity that made me simultaneously terrified and oddly proud. No one was running ahead, tiny fists clutching the petals I had strewn across the forest path like breadcrumbs. He'd insisted on helping despite my protests. "It's tactical, Mom," he had said, eyes sparkling with the kind of dangerous cleverness only a 12-year-old could possess. "If you get kidnapped again, I'll know where to lead, Dad." I had muttered something about being careful with that vocabulary and kids should not be this smart, but my protests had been drowned out by the chaos. Now, those little petals were guiding Lucen straight to me. My chest swelled with a mixture of relief and mortification. The masked figure lunged at me again. I twisted, dodged, and stumbled, catching a glint of metal as their sword tip threatened my side. "This is it," I shrieked to myself, fully expecting the universe to end my story here, at the climax, in the mud, soaked, and still clutching my dignity somewhere under the skirt of my dress. Then Lucen was there. I barely saw him approach. The way he moved was terrifyingly smooth, predatory even, but also precise. With one motion, he deflected the villain's blade and shoved me behind him, all without breaking eye contact with the masked fiend. My hands went immediately to my face, like covering my eyes could somehow make danger vanish. It didn't. Lucen didn't care. He simply stood there, unwavering, radiating a power I hadn't fully comprehended until this moment. "You underestimate her," he said. Low, cold, deadly. And then he struck. The masked figure stumbled backward, startled by the ferocity and speed that seemed to bend reality itself. Lucen's movements were art and fury combined, every step calculated, every swing of the blade precise. I had never seen him like this, not at the garden, not at the banquet, not even when he laughed faintly at Morel's insults. This was pure, unrestrained Duke. I peeked out from behind him. He caught my glance and, without breaking his focus, gave a brief nod. A nod. It was enough. It was terrifying, intimate, and completely infuriating. Somehow, even amidst the chaos, my chest fluttered. No one, ever the strategist, had ducked behind a tree, peeking out. "Stepmother, now." "Distract him," he whispered urgently. Distract him? I was 1, terrified, 2, wet, 3, muddy, and 4, lacking both weapons and dignity. But what the hell? Improvisation was my only skill. "Hey!" I yelled, jumping out. "Over here, you overgrown nightmare of a villain." The masked figure hissed, lunging toward me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I kicked mud in their face. Completely unglamorous, slightly disgusting, but it worked. Their grip loosened on me for just long enough that Lucen advanced. He moved like a shadow, precise and lethal, knocking the sword aside and disarming the figure with a speed that made my head spin. Then, in a motion so smooth it looked choreographed, he pinched the masked villain's arm, twisted, and sent them sprawling into the mud. They groaned, defeated and humiliated, their carefully curated menace completely undone by a combination of Lucen's fury and my mud attack. I gaped. Wow, my words failed me, as usual, because nothing in my internal survival manual prepared me for witnessing pure rage that was both horrifying and inexplicably attractive. Lucen turned to me then, chest heaving, rain dripping from his hair and coat, eyes smoldering with unspoken emotion. "Are you all right?" His voice had softened, though the intensity lingered, a dangerous edge that made me shiver. "Yes," I said quickly, trying to sound confident. "Thanks to you." And mud. I gestured vaguely at the villain. "Mostly you, though." He gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "You are not to blame. Stay behind me next time." "Noted," I muttered. Then I added under my breath, "Next time, you're also bringing snacks." Because nothing says survival like emergency rations. He didn't laugh. Which, honestly, made sense. But the heat in his gaze stayed with me, lingering in a way that made me want to lean in and pretend the world wasn't trying to kill me every 5 minutes. No one bounded over, grins smeared with mud. "See, I told you. Operation. Dad goes ferocious works." Lucen looked down at him, voice softened by pride. "And you led me right to her." I wanted to say something witty, something sarcastic. Instead, I just let myself breathe, letting the rain soak my dress, my hair, my ego, because I was alive. The villain was neutralized, the forest silent except for the rain. And Lucen, my formidable, terrifying, completely out of control for me Lucen was standing beside me, arms tense and ready, but his eyes were only for me. You see, I said finally, catching my breath, this is why we can't have nice kidnappings. Or predictable stories. Or anything that makes sense. He didn't answer, but his hand brushed mine accidental, maybe, but meaningful enough that my chest did that ridiculous hammering thing again. We walked back toward the mansion in silence, the rain letting up slightly. My skirts squelched with every step, mud clinging to me, hair dripping. Lucen stayed close, protective, but not overbearing, letting me catch my breath and my composure. Somehow, the storm had passed, but inside me, something else had shifted. I glanced up at him, breathless. You really scare me sometimes, I admitted, trying for humor. And you like it, he said softly. I rolled my eyes, mud dripping down my temple. Don't get used to it. But deep down, I knew. After today, after seeing that ferocity, after surviving the forest and the villain and my own panic, I couldn't pretend anymore. Lucen wasn't just the Duke of Rion. He was my protector, my chaos, my terrifyingly handsome problem. And maybe, just maybe, he was worth every muddy step, every danger, every ridiculous plot twist life threw at me. We arrived at the mansion gates, no end skipping ahead, triumphantly waving petals like a flag. Inside, I would clean, change, and probably sulk about my ruined dress, but I was alive. And for the first time, I felt it. The story might try to challenge me, but I had an ally. A terrifying, feral, wonderful ally. And in the shadow of the Rion estate, the Duke's fury had not only saved me, it had reminded me, as all good drama should, that the person I was growing to love would fight for me in ways I could never imagine. Chapter 18. The greenhouse loomed before us, glass panes jagged from some earlier sabotage, shadows twisting in the stormy twilight like dark fingers. The air smelled of wet earth, crushed petals, and danger, the kind of danger that made my hair stand on end even before I fully understood it. Every nightmare I had about this place, the one I had tried so hard to rewrite in my head, was suddenly alive, waving at me with sharp, thorned fingers. Noan skidded to a stop at the doorway, his little hands trembling around my father's arm. "Mom, it's worse than the last time," he whispered. "The roses, they're broken." I took a deep, shivering breath. Broken roses or not, this was it. This was the climax of the chapter that wanted to kill me. And I had no intention of letting the story dictate my ending. A masked figure emerged from behind a toppled rose trellis, eyes glittering with malice. "You really thought you could escape," the villain hissed. "You're still the same doomed Duchess." I swallowed. "Not today, villainy," I muttered under my breath. "Today, I rewrite the rules." The first attack came fast, a swipe, meant to catch me off guard. I ducked, colliding with a broken pot, and yelped as shards bit into my palms. But adrenaline pumped through me like fire, and for the first time, I didn't just react, I fought back. I grabbed a wooden trellis and swung, the wood connecting with a sickening thwack to the villain's side. They staggered. I staggered. We were a mess of mud, petals, and adrenaline, but I was alive, and that was all that mattered. Lucen appeared then, as if conjured by fate itself. Sword drawn, coat whipping in the storm, eyes blazing with a ferocity I hadn't known he could summon. "No one rewrites her ending but her," he said, voice calm yet terrifying, a feral promise buried beneath every syllable. My heart did a ridiculous flip-flop. That was my line. My line. And somehow, hearing it from him, not in my mind, not in a storybook, but from him, made me feel like I wasn't alone in this fight. He moved with a precision that made my jaw ache to watch. Parry, strike, step, every motion fluid, deadly, protective. The villain hissed, realizing their carefully laid plan had underestimated the Duke of Rion's wrath. And me. Somehow me too. I ducked another swipe, pressed my back against the wet glass, and shoved my thumb into the villain's side. They yelped, clutching themselves, and I grabbed a fallen rose branch, thorns and all, swinging wildly. Some of the petals, blue ones I had planted in my delusional hope of happiness, fluttered to the floor like confetti at a tragic wedding. "Noan," I shouted, finally remembering him. He was crouched near a toppled shelf, eyes wide, holding a decorative watering can like it was a weapon. "Stay there. You're helpful, but also likely to get hurt." "Too late," he shouted back, with the reckless optimism only a 12-year-old could sustain. Then he threw the can at the villain. The metallic clang echoed in the greenhouse, giving Lucen the opening he needed. He moved like lightning, disarming the villain with a swift sweep of his sword. The masked figure stumbled, eyes wide, and I seized the moment. I kicked mud into their boots, tripped over my own skirts, and somehow ended up on top of them. I gasped. "This is my fight." Lucen's voice, low and steady, cut through the chaos. "Eira, stop flailing long enough for me to help you." I blinked. Right. Teamwork. I rolled to the side, allowing him to pin the villain down, sword at their throat. The storm outside raged, but inside, the battle ended. I sagged to the ground, exhausted, mud and petals clinging to me, but victorious. Lucen lowered the sword, stepping close. Rain dripped from his hair onto my shoulder. "Are you hurt?" His eyes scanned me like he could see every bruise, every scratch, every panic-stricken heartbeat I had endured. Mostly, I admitted, emotionally and in the knees. Mud? Check. Pride? Destroyed. But alive. He knelt, brushing a strand of wet hair from my face, his fingers warm, grounding. "Good," he murmured. "Because I'm not letting anything or anyone harm you again." I wanted to argue. I wanted to make a witty remark about his melodrama. But the sound of my own heartbeat, hammering in my chest at the feel of his fingers on my cheek, made coherent speech impossible. No one crawled over, triumphant and breathless. "We did it. Stepmother, Dad, we're heroes." I laughed, the sound dripping with relief, wet and raw. "Yes, we're heroes," I said, ruffling his damp hair. "And now we go home before anything else decides it wants to kill us." Lucen extended a hand, and I took it hesitant, dripping, and completely aware of how close he was. "I believe," he said, voice quiet, but carrying the weight of all he had just done, "that you did more than survive. You fought. You didn't pass out?" I supplied, trying to regain some dignity. He didn't smile, not yet, but his gaze softened. "Yes, that too." We exited the greenhouse together, stepping over petals and shattered glass. Rain still fell, light and cold, but somehow, the air smelled like victory. Or maybe that was just me, delusional as usual. Later, as I changed into a dry dress, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Hair sticking out at every angle, mud streaked across my sleeves, and a faint scar from where I had tripped over a flower pot, but alive. Alive and victorious. And Lucen, he stayed close, standing just outside my door, the storm of the last hour reflected in the dark intensity of his eyes. "You were brilliant," he said softly. "Even if completely reckless." "Completely," I agreed. "And you?" "You were terrifyingly feral." He let out a quiet, almost amused chuckle. "Feral was necessary." We didn't say more. We didn't need to. I could feel it in the tense way his shoulders flexed, the way he kept just close enough, the way his hand brushed mine occasionally. No words could capture the storm we had survived. That night, as the rain finally tapered off and the greenhouse glistened under the moonlight, I realized something important. I was no longer the victim of someone else's story. No longer the doomed Duchess waiting for chapter 28. I was Eira Valen, sarcastic, panicked, but courageous. And for the first time, I truly believed I could survive anything. Even love. Chapter 19. The rain had stopped, leaving the ground slick and sparkling under the pale light of the morning sun. The greenhouse looked like a war zone from a fairy tale, shattered glass glinting among broken branches, muddy petals scattered like confetti, and faint smoke curling from the few scorched spots left from the villain's chaotic departure. Somewhere nearby, the culprit, the one who had tried to drag me into a tragic ending, was firmly restrained, looking more confused and disgruntled than threatening. Lucen had ensured it personally, of course. I peeked at him from behind the doorframe of the greenhouse, his expression calm, meticulous, but with that faint tension in his jaw that always meant he was still dangerous and terrifying and somehow mine. I exhaled, letting myself relax slightly for the first time in days. "We survived," I whispered to the empty air, as though admitting it aloud would make it real. Then Lucen appeared, silent as a shadow, boots making no sound on the wet cobblestones. He bent slightly, lifting me effortlessly into his arms. "Careful," he murmured, voice steady, not a trace of anger, only concern. "You're soaked, mud-covered, and possibly harboring mild hypothermia. You should rest." I pressed my wet cheek against his chest, feeling the warmth of him and the steady beat of his heart. "And, as ridiculous as it sounds," I teased. "All heroic and romantic like a husband, huh?" He looked down at me, dark eyes narrowing, and deadpanned, "Then I'll have to keep acting forever." I snorted, a mixture of relief, amusement, and admittedly something dangerously close to affection bubbling in my chest. Good. That's a full-time job then. I expect overtime pay in chocolate and roses. He didn't answer. He just carried me through the drenched gardens toward the mansion, his coat dripping water onto the stone path. Somehow it felt domestic. Heroic, yes, but domestic in the way of someone who has chosen to fight for you, protect you, and carry you home. All at once. No one, ever the dramatic observer, was crouched behind a bush, peeking out with wide, gleeful eyes. Stepmother. You look like a soggy princess. I wrinkled my nose. Thanks, Noen. Compliments accepted. And you. Living. And witnessing epic heroism, he shouted, leaping forward to run alongside us, leaving muddy footprints across the immaculate mansion steps. Dad's terrifying, right? And you survived the whole thing. Yes, I admitted, brushing mud from my skirts. And he's terrifying and heroic. And possibly completely unhinged. Lucen's hand brushed mine, not a touch that demanded anything, just a subtle, grounding connection, and I realized how much I had relied on that quiet, protective presence over the past weeks. My pulse betrayed me, making my teasing tone wobble slightly. And I thought I didn't need a duke to survive, I muttered under my breath, half to myself, half to him. He gave me one of those fleeting looks, where all his usual reserve slipped for a heartbeat. I swear, in that moment, the chaos of the greenhouse, the villain, the storm, it all faded. Just him. Just us. And yes, Noen, skipping ahead like a miniature herald announcing our survival. Once inside the mansion, Lucen set me down gently, still holding my gaze. Rest, he said simply. Not orders, just concern. You've earned it. I collapsed onto a velvet chaise, letting myself sink into it. Mud was caked everywhere, my hair was dripping and sticking to my face, and my dress had somehow developed a permanent crease in a rather unfortunate place. But I didn't care. I was alive. And that realization was almost intoxicating. Noen bounced over, dragging a towel and a basket of warm blankets. I get to help first, he declared. Stepmother hero. Must be pampered. Fine, I said, surrendering to the absurdity. Pamper away, but I expect compliments afterward. And don't forget heroic speeches. He rolled his eyes dramatically, but wrapped me in blankets anyway. Heroism acknowledged. Damsel intact. Villain defeated. All thanks to you and Dad, obviously. I glanced over at Lucen, who had quietly moved to the side, watching us, coat dripping, hair plastered, and expression unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, pride, relief, and that faint shadow of affection that always made my chest ache. Do you ever sleep? I asked, finally daring to break the silence, voice teasing but softer than I intended. Lucen raised an eyebrow. Rarely. But today, I slept through the villain's plan. I smirked, despite the exhaustion. Lucky for me. And for the first time since waking up in this absurdly dangerous version of my own life, I laughed freely, a full belly laugh that echoed through the grand halls. No one joined in, and even Lucen's lips twitched, a brief, almost imperceptible smile that made my heart stutter. Later, when the cleanup had begun, the greenhouse repaired, petals swept, villain properly handed over to authorities, I found myself in the study. Lucen was there, quietly reviewing some papers, looking impossibly composed for a man who had just fought through storms, mud, and an armed assailant. I perched on the edge of a chair, brushing wet hair back. You know, I said, I could get used to surviving dangerous chapters with you. Provided you promise not to be terrifying all the time. He looked up, eyes glinting. No promises. Fear is part of my charm. I groaned dramatically. And yet somehow, the part won like most. He ignored the jab, but that faint twitch in his lips betrayed him. Tomorrow, we resume normal life, he said, voice firm. Tea. Lessons. No kidnappings. Promised, I said, still wrapped in blankets and victory. And maybe we can try not to die again for at least a week? No one rolled his eyes, clearly amused at my melodrama. 1 week? That's ambitious. I shot him a glare but smiled at the same time. It was true, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving, laughing, and learning to find joy in chaos. With Lucen at my side, and no one complicating everything with laughter and schemes, life felt messy, yes, but alive. And finally, as I leaned back into the warmth of the room, watching Lucen quietly organize his papers, I realized something fundamental. Surviving the plot twist, the villain, the greenhouse, the storm wasn't the real victory. The real victory was the little moments afterward, the teasing, the protective glances, the quiet, shared relief, and the slow, creeping realization that I didn't just want to survive. I wanted to live. Fully. Messily. And with them both, for as long as fate would allow. I smiled, letting the blankets envelop me, and whispered, just enough for myself to hear, "We did it. We survived. And maybe, just maybe, I'm finally home." Lucen glanced up, dark eyes meeting mine, and for the first time, his usual composure cracked into something softer. "Yes," he said quietly. "Home." Noen, ever dramatic, clapped once loudly. And thus concludes Chapter 19, After the Storm. Heroic family, check. Surviving Duchess, check. Terrifyingly handsome Duke, double check. I laughed again, ruffling his hair. Perfect summary, little strategist. But let's save the rest for tomorrow. And for the first time since this story began, I felt a calm I hadn't known in weeks. The storm was over. The danger was past. And life, ours, messy and hilarious and frighteningly wonderful, stretched out in front of me like an unwritten chapter waiting for me to choose the words. Chapter 20. Spring had arrived like an over-enthusiastic painter, splashing color across every corner of the Rion estate. The gardens were alive with blooms, tulips, lilies, and roses of every conceivable hue, but none as striking as the blue roses that now ran like a secret current through the hedges, their glow faint under the morning sun. The festival we'd been planning for weeks finally came to life. Lanterns bobbed in the breeze, music spilled into every corner of the gardens, and townspeople wandered among food stalls and games, laughing freely without a care for the Duchess and Duke drama that usually colored their imaginations. I wandered through the crowd in a light, flowing dress that caught the wind in the most inconvenient places, threatening to reveal far more leg than was socially acceptable. Noen, ever the dramatic spectacle, had insisted I wear something fancy but functional, which apparently meant frills and puffed sleeves. I was still perfecting my ability to stride gracefully in heels without tripping, a skill I'd failed to master during every near-death incident over the past weeks. "Stepmother. Over here." Noen waved me over, holding a bouquet proudly in both hands. I bent down, squinting at the small arrangement, and realized with some delight that each flower had been carefully chosen by him. The colors clashed gloriously, reds and yellows, and one daring blue rose peeking from the center. "I won," he declared, chest puffed. "First prize, obviously. And I didn't even cheat." I laughed, ruffling his hair. "Of course you didn't. That would be dishonorable. Like a knight of the garden." He beamed, clutching my hand briefly before darting off to show some particularly oblivious noble how victory should look. And then there was Lucen. He appeared almost silently, stepping through a small arch of cherry blossoms that trembled in the light spring breeze. He held a single blue rose between his fingers, the kind that faintly glowed in sunlight, an echo of our greenhouse battles and survival streaks. The crowd parted for him like he was royalty incarnate, and, of course, he was, but my eyes were fixed only on him. "It doesn't wilt," he said softly, pressing the rose into my hand with a gentle finality that made my fingers tingle. "I thought you might like one that survives everything, like you." I blinked at him, a little stunned, a little flustered, and entirely certain that my heartbeat had decided to skip entirely out of excitement and disbelief. You didn't just fight the villain, tame the greenhouse chaos, and survive storms. You've been plotting poetic gestures all along?" He shrugged, impossibly calm. It seemed fitting. "And besides," he said, inclining his head toward Noen, he insisted we celebrate heroism today. "This is part of heroism." I laughed. "Heroism? Survival. Tears. Blue roses." A tiny boy gleefully asserting his triumph. And somewhere beneath all that, a warm, stubborn, unmistakable affection for the impossibly handsome Duke standing beside me. The festival went on around us. Children ran by, faces smudged with icing from honey tarts, their laughter weaving through the music and lantern light. Townsfolk danced in pairs, some attempting formal steps and falling hilariously into one another, while older ladies whispered about the new Duchess's miraculous survival and uncanny resemblance to the late Duchess. I waved at them, smiling like a professional, internally congratulating myself on not fainting. Lucen and I strolled along a flower-lined path, hand brushing against hand, the kind of intimate touch that had grown from panic, fear, and survival into something far more tender and grounding. "You know," I said, trying to sound casual while secretly terrified of admitting how much I enjoyed his proximity, "I used to think surviving a story meant hiding from everyone and everything. But this, I gestured at the blooming gardens, the laughter, no one skipping ahead, and him beside me, this is infinitely better. His gaze softened in that rare way, the kind that made the usual stoicism drop like a curtain. I believe it's called living, Eira, he said. Surviving is just the first step. The second is deciding who you survive for. I choked back a giggle and then a small sigh, trying to act nonchalant as his words wrapped around me like a warm cloak. I think I survived, for both of you. For me, too. Somehow. But mostly, for you too. Noen, overhearing from a few steps ahead, piped up dramatically, I vote for all three of us surviving. That way we can have ice cream later. Yes, excellent vote, I said, laughing, scooping him up in my arms. Voting counts for double if you're small and adorable. Lucen rolled his eyes at our antics, but didn't protest. He simply adjusted his coat, brushing imaginary lint off my shoulder as if that made him less ridiculously handsome. I felt my cheeks warm. Later, the sun began to dip, casting the estate in golden light. Lanterns flickered to life, floating above the gardens like a constellation fallen to earth. Lucen leaned down, pressing his palm lightly against mine. So, he murmured, voice low and teasing, I suppose we're stuck together now. Permanently. Officially. I grinned, heart light, humor dancing in my eyes. Thankfully. I think I'd miss being rescued, argued with, and entirely exasperated by you if we weren't. He tilted his head, one dark eyebrow raised. You mean you wouldn't survive otherwise? Oh, I'd survive, I said, voice firm. But not this happily. Not this, messy. Not this entirely ours. We stood like that for a moment, hands entwined, eyes locked, watching Noen dart about like the triumphant little general of our lives. And I realized, truly, that the fear that had haunted me, the fear of the story, the novel, the fate I was born to repeat was gone. Replaced with this, with now, with the chaos and warmth of family we had carved out ourselves. I inhaled deeply, smelling wet earth, blooming roses, and faint leather from Lucen's coat. You know, I said softly, I think I've finally rewritten the story. And this ending, this one is mine. Lucen's hand tightened around mine, thumb brushing reassuringly over my knuckles. Then we'll write the next chapters together, he said. Every day, every small moment, and all the disasters we can survive. I smiled, letting my head rest against his shoulder just slightly. Deal. But next time, maybe fewer villains, okay? He laughed quietly, that low, rare sound that always made my chest tighten. We'll see. But even if there are villains, Eira, he leaned closer, just enough for me to feel the warmth of his breath. I promise, we'll survive them. Together. Noen, deciding that dramatic flair was necessary, dropped to one knee nearby, presenting the blue rose he had saved from the contest. For Mom, he shouted, and I laughed so hard I nearly cried. I accepted the flower, tucking it into my hair, and realized something extraordinary. The roses bloomed eternal, the blue ones glowing faintly like memories made real, and they were as defiant as we were. I wasn't just surviving the story anymore. I was living it. And for the first time, my story was unafraid, joyful, and entirely mine. Lucen bent down, pressing a quick, gentle kiss to my temple. I'm glad we survived. But more importantly, I'm glad you're still entirely yourself. Fierce, sarcastic, heroic, and remarkably stubborn. I laughed, letting myself melt into him and the chaos of the festival around us. I wouldn't have it any other way. The lanterns floated higher, the sun dipped lower, and for the first time, I thought not of danger or death or cursed novels, but of warmth, laughter, and a life we had truly earned. And as Lucen's hand held mine, and Noen danced around us in victory, I knew no matter what stories tried to trap me, no matter how many chapters attempted to kill me, the roses, the love, and the family we had built would bloom eternal. Because finally, I had rewritten the story. And this time, I would live it. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more tales from Sparrow's Realm. Until next time, keep listening, and let your imagination soar.